Alexander the Great, the undefeated military genius who, before the age of 33, shattered the Persian Empire, conquered the known world from Greece to India, and changed the course of history forever.
The Battle of Issus and the Collapse of Persian Confidence. In November 333 BCE, the two armies finally collided near the Pinarus River at Issus. This was the battle that defined the era. It wasn't just a clash of spears, it was a clash of nerves. Darius had the numbers, but Alexander had the psychology. The fatal mistake, the narrow field. Darius made a catastrophic tactical error that cost him the war before it started. He chose to fight on a narrow coastal plain sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains. The geography trap. The field was only about 2.5 miles wide. The consequence? Darius had huge numbers, possibly 100,000 plus, but in this narrow space he couldn't spread them out to surround Alexander. His massive cavalry was jammed together, useless. Alexander's smaller, disciplined army faced only a fraction of the Persian force at a time. The charge at the king. Alexander noticed that Darius was positioned in the center of the Persian line, standing high in his royal chariot. Alexander ignored the rest of the battle and made a decision that is now legendary. The headhunter strategy. Alexander gathered his elite companion cavalry into a sharp wedge and charged directly at Darius. He didn't want to kill soldiers, he wanted to kill the head of the snake. The Mosaic moment. This specific charge is immortalized in the famous Alexander mosaic. Alexander with wild eyes and no helmet, fighting his way through the royal guards to get to the terrified king. The collapse. Darius broke. As Alexander hacked his way closer, killing the king's brother Oxythres who tried to defend him, Darius looked into Alexander's eyes. At that moment, the great king of Persia panicked. The flight. Instead of fighting to the death like a warrior, Darius turned his chariot around and fled. The symbolism. When the Persian soldiers saw their god-king running away while the battle was still raging, their morale instantly evaporated. The collapse was total. The army broke rank and was slaughtered by the Macedonians. The abandoned symbols. Darius was so terrified that when the terrain became too rough for his chariot, he jumped out. Items left behind? He left behind his royal chariot, his bow, and his royal mantle or cloak. The meaning? In the ancient world, leaving your bow and cloak was the ultimate sign of cowardice. When Alexander later found these items, he held them up and famously said, "So, this is what it means to be a king." The capture of the family. The most humiliating part of the defeat was what Darius left behind in the camp, his wife, his mother, and his children. Part 31 mentioned his arrogance in bringing them. Part 32 shows the price of that arrogance. The scene. When Alexander entered the Persian camp, he heard women screaming. It was Darius's family, who thought Alexander would kill them. The mercy. Alexander did not harm them. He treated them as royalty, promising to find husbands for the daughters and treating Darius's mother, Sisygambis, as his own mother. This act of mercy hurt Darius's reputation even more than the defeat. Alexander had proven he was a better king than Darius. The Battle of Issus was the end of Persian confidence. The spell of the great king was broken. Darius was now a fugitive running east, leaving his family and his honor in the hands of a 23-year-old European. Alexander was no longer just an invader. He was now the master of the Persian royal household. The road to Egypt and the throne of the pharaohs was now wide open.
Darius's flight and the capture of the royal family. While Darius was galloping into the night, abandoning his empire, a very different scene was unfolding inside the Persian camp. Alexander had not just captured prisoners, he had captured the heart of the Persian dynasty. The misunderstanding. Tears for the dead. Immediately after the battle, a wailing sound echoed from the Persian royal tent, Alexander sent a messenger to find out why the women were screaming. The empty chariot. The queen mother, Sisygambis, and Queen Statara were crying not because they were captured, but because they had seen Darius's empty chariot and bloody bow brought into the camp. The error. They assumed Darius was dead. They were mourning a ghost. The relief. Alexander sent a message clarifying, "Darius is alive. I am fighting him for supremacy, not out of personal hatred." This was the first sign that Alexander intended to be a gentleman, not a barbarian. The culture shock. The bath of Darius. Before meeting the women, Alexander inspected Darius's personal tent. He was stunned. He saw golden bathtubs, pitchers full of expensive perfumes, and dinner tables set with crystal. So this is what it means to be a king. Alexander, who grew up sleeping on hard ground and eating simple bread, looked at this unimaginable luxury. He turned to his friends and sarcastically remarked, "It seems this is what it means to be a king." He then ordered Darius's dinner to be served, but threw out the luxurious furniture, preferring his own simple soldier's chair. The morning visit. A comedy of errors. The next morning, Alexander went to visit the royal women. He brought only one person with him, his best friend, Hephaestion. The visual confusion. The two young men entered the tent without guards. Alexander was short, blond, and clean-shaven. Hephaestion was taller, more muscular, and looked more royal than Alexander. Sisygambis, Darius's mother, not knowing who was who, instinctively threw herself at Hephaestion's feet, thinking he was the king. The terrifying realization. The eunuchs behind her signaled frantically, whispering that she had bowed to the wrong man. Sisygambis was terrified. In the Persian court, disrespecting the king meant instant death. She fell to the floor again, apologizing to Alexander. He, too, is Alexander. This moment could have ended in bloodshed. Instead, it became one of history's most beautiful moments of friendship. Alexander pulled the old woman to her feet. He did not get angry. He pointed to Hephaestion and said, "Do not worry, mother. You made no mistake, for he too is Alexander." The meaning. By saying this, Alexander declared that he and Hephaestion were one soul in two bodies. It showed his immense love for his friend and his mercy toward the queen. The promise. Alexander made a vow to the women. He promised that they would keep their royal titles, their jewelry and servants would remain with them. He would arrange marriages for Darius's daughters that were worthy of their station. From that day on, Sisygambis disowned her coward son Darius and treated Alexander as her own child. She eventually became so loyal to him that when Alexander died years later, she reportedly starved herself to death out of grief. The capture of the royal family was a PR masterpiece. Alexander showed the world that he was not just a killer, but a king capable of mercy and grace. While Darius was running like a fugitive, Alexander was acting like the true successor to the Persian throne, adopting the great king's mother when her own son had abandoned her.
Alexander's treatment of the captives and the first peace offer. While Alexander treated the royal women with gentleness, the war was far from over. Darius was safe in Babylon, regrouping his forces. What followed was a war of words. For the first time, the two kings communicated directly, and the letters they exchanged revealed that the balance of power had permanently shifted. A change in policy, the other captives. At the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander had butchered the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia. At Issus, he changed his strategy. Pragmatism over punishment. Thousands of Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius were captured at Issus. Instead of killing them as traitors, Alexander offered them a choice: join me or go home. He realized he needed more soldiers to conquer the vast East. By showing mercy, he encouraged other enemy units to surrender in the future. He was evolving from a vengeful punisher into a pragmatic empire builder. The first letter from Darius. Some time after the battle, a messenger arrived from Darius. The letter was polite, but maintained the tone of a superior speaking to an equal. The request. Darius asked for the return of his mother, wife, and children. He offered to pay a ransom for them. The offer of alliance. Darius proposed that he and Alexander should sign a treaty of friendship and alliance. He effectively said, "Let's forget this happened. Give me my family, take some money, and go back to Macedonia." Darius still didn't understand who he was dealing with. He thought Alexander was a raider looking for loot, not a conqueror looking for a throne. The Manifesto. I am the king of Asia. Alexander's reply to this letter is one of the most famous documents in antiquity. He did not write back as a fellow king, he wrote back as a master. The blame game. Alexander started by listing the crimes of Persia. Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and Greece and caused havoc. I have crossed into Asia to punish you. The rejection of equality. He furiously rejected the offer of being friends and allies. He wrote, "By the grace of the gods, I have won. I possess the land, and I possess your family. Come to me, and you shall have them." The new title. The chilling part of the letter was the closing demand. Alexander ordered Darius to change the way he addressed him. In the future, when you send me a letter, address it to the king of Asia and not as an equal. Do not write to me as if you still owned anything, for everything you possess is now mine. If you want to dispute this, stand and fight, but do not run away. This exchange of letters marked the point of no return. Darius realized that Alexander could not be bought off with gold. Alexander had officially claimed the title King of Asia. There would be no peace treaty, no split territories, and no alliance. The war would only end when one of them was dead. Alexander packed up his camp and marched south towards Phoenicia, determined to take every inch of land Darius had left. The Siege of Tyre, an island that refused to fall. In January 332 BCE, Alexander arrived in Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon. Most cities opened their gates, terrified by his victory at Issus, but Tyre was different. It was the richest naval power in the world, and it believed it was untouchable. The geography of the impossible. Tyre was not just a city, it was a fortress in the middle of the sea. The location. The main city stood on an island 800 meters, or half a mile, from the shore. The defenses. It was surrounded by massive stone walls rising 150 feet high, straight out of the water. The Tyrians laughed at Alexander. They had a powerful navy, and Alexander had none, since he had disbanded it. They believed no land army could touch them. The religious insult. The war started over a prayer. Alexander politely asked to enter the city to offer a sacrifice to his ancestor Hercules, who the Tyrians called Melkart. The Tyrians refused. "We are welcome to sacrifice at the temple on the mainland, but no Macedonian soldier will step foot on the island." Alexander took this as a personal insult. He told his generals, "If they will not let me walk to their island, I will turn their island into a peninsula." Rewriting nature, the mole. Since he had no ships to cross the water, Alexander decided to bring the land to the city. He ordered his engineers to build a mole, a massive land bridge or causeway through the deep ocean. Demolishing the past. Where did he get the rocks? He ordered his soldiers to destroy Old Tyre, the abandoned city on the shore. They threw every stone, pillar, and tree into the sea to form the foundation of the bridge. the danger zone. At first, the water was shallow and work was easy, but as they got closer to the island, the water became 20 feet deep. The Tyrian archers stood on their high walls and rained arrows down on the Macedonian workers, making construction a living hell. The counterattack, the fire ship. To protect his workers, Alexander built 2 massive wooden siege towers, the tallest ever built, and placed them at the end of the bridge to shoot back at the Tyrians. The Tyrians responded with a terrifying weapon, the floating bomb. They took an old horse transport ship and filled it with dried pitch, sulfur, and oil. They set it on fire and rode it straight into Alexander's wooden towers. The destruction. The towers caught fire instantly. The Macedonians jumped into the sea to escape, where they were beaten or drowned by Tyrian sailors. In one afternoon, months of Alexander's work was burned to ashes. The siege had failed. The bridge was destroyed, the towers were burnt, and the Tyrians were cheering from their walls. For the first time, Alexander looked like he was losing. He realized that brute force and engineering were not enough. To take an island, he had to swallow his pride and find a navy. The land animal had to learn to swim.
Engineering the impossible, the causeway and the fall of Tyre. July 332 BCE. After the disaster of the first bridge, most generals would have quit. Alexander did not. He realized that to take the island, he couldn't just build a road. He needed to rule the sea. The second phase of the siege turned into a display of industrial slaughter and terrifying engineering. The gathering of the fleet. Alexander realized he couldn't walk to the island if the Tyrian navy controlled the water, so he went shopping for ships. He traveled north and intimidated the kings of Cyprus and Sidon into joining him. The turnaround. Suddenly, Alexander returned to Tyre not with empty hands, but with a massive fleet of 220 warships. He blockaded the island, trapping the Tyrians inside. Now his workers could rebuild the causeway, bridge, without being shot at from the sea. Horror from above, the burning sand. As the Macedonians got closer to the walls, the Tyrians invented a weapon straight out of a nightmare. They heated fine sand in massive cauldrons until it was glowing red hot. The effect: when the Macedonians attacked the walls, the Tyrians dumped the hot sand on them. The sand slipped through the gaps in their armor and burned their skin off. Soldiers threw themselves into the sea in agony. It was a weapon of pure torture. The floating rams and the breach. Since the walls were too strong, Alexander mounted huge battering rams on his ships. This was one of the first times in history artillery was used from the water. The breakthrough. After months of pounding, a section of the southern wall collapsed. Alexander didn't wait. He personally led the charge across a boarding plank, fighting his way onto the city walls. Once the king was inside, the army followed like a flood. The massacre and the crucifixions. The battle for the streets was vicious. The Tyrians knew they would not be spared, so they fought to the death. The slaughter. 8,000 Tyrians died in the fighting. The slavery. 30,000 citizens, mostly women and children, were sold into slavery. The final message. Alexander was furious at the Tyrians for defying him for 7 months and killing his men. To send a message to the rest of the world, he gathered 2,000 surviving men of military age. He dragged them to the long beach of the mainland and crucified every single one of them. The coastline was lined with miles of dying men on crosses. Tyre, the city that had stood for 1,000 years and defied mighty empires, was gone. It was no longer an island. Alexander's causeway had permanently connected it to the mainland, which remains true even today. The world watched in horror.
Alexander had proven that no walls were high enough and no sea was deep enough to save you from his wrath. Next stop, Egypt. Brutality and message, the aftermath of Tyre. The screams of the dying had faded, and the crosses lined the shore. But for Alexander, the destruction of Tyre was not just about punishment. It was about completing a religious mission and answering a political question. The smoke of Tyre sent a message that traveled faster than any messenger. Resistance means death. Mercy for the elites, death for the masses. While 2,000 common soldiers were dying on crosses outside, a very different scene took place inside the Temple of Heracles. When Alexander burst into the city, the king of Tyre, Asimilchus, along with the high priests, had taken refuge inside the temple. The class bias. Alexander did not kill them. He pardoned the king and the nobles instantly. The message. This revealed Alexander's worldview. He respected royalty. He believed kings should not kill other kings unless absolutely necessary. The punishment was for the common people who dared to fight back. The elites were spared to rule another day under his command. Mission accomplished. The sacrifice. The whole war started because Alexander wanted to pray. Now, walking over the rubble of the city, he finally did it. He held a massive military parade and a religious festival in the ruins. The dedication. He sacrificed to Heracles. To honor the god, he dedicated the battering ram that had broken the wall and a Tyrian ship he had captured, placing them in the temple as gifts. He had destroyed an entire civilization just to perform this one ritual. The second letter from Darius, the price of fear. The fall of Tyre shook the world. It terrified King Darius III more than the loss at Issus. Darius realized Alexander was unstoppable. He sent a second, desperate letter. This time, he didn't demand, he begged. He offered 10,000 talents of gold, an unimaginable fortune as ransom for his family, all the territory west of the Euphrates River. Essentially, Darius was offering to split the civilized world in half. Alexander would rule the West, Europe and Africa, and Darius would rule the East, Asia. The famous debate, Alexander versus Parmenion. This offer led to the most famous conversation in the history of Alexander's campaigns. His old general, Parmenion, read the letter and was stunned by the massive amount of gold and land. Parmenion's logic. Parmenion said to Alexander, "If I were Alexander, I would accept these terms and end the war." To Parmenion, the war was won. They had secured Greece's safety and gained massive wealth. Why risk more? Alexander's arrogance. Alexander looked at the old man and replied with a line that defined his destiny. "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The rejection. He told the messenger, "Tell Darius that there can be no two suns in the sky, nor two masters of the earth." He rejected the offer. He didn't want half the world. He wanted the whole thing. The aftermath of Tyre clarified everything. Alexander was not fighting for security, money, or territory. He was fighting for total domination. The destruction of Tyre proved his brutality, and the rejection of Darius's offer proved his ambition. There was no going back now. The path to Egypt was clear, but one final obstacle stood in his way, a fortress city called Gaza, commanded by a man who was not afraid of monsters.
The siege and destruction of Gaza. It was late 332 BCE. Tyre had fallen, and the road to Egypt seemed open. But standing directly in the path was the ancient fortress city of Gaza. Unlike the commercial city of Tyre, Gaza was a military stronghold guarding the spice route. It was commanded by a man who would push Alexander's rage to a new, terrifying level. The commander, Baitus the eunuch. The governor of Gaza was a man named Baitus. He was a Persian loyalist and a eunuch. Unlike other governors who surrendered when they saw Alexander's army, Baitus hired Arab mercenaries and stocked the city with food for a long siege. The defiance. Baitus refused to negotiate. He looked at the fate of Tyre and decided he would rather die than bow to the Macedonian boy. The engineering challenge, conquering height. Gaza presented a problem opposite to that of Tyre. The problem: the city was built on a massive artificial mound, a tell, surrounded by soft sand. It was so high that Alexander's engineers told him, "It is impossible to aim our siege engines at the walls because the ground is too low." The solution? Alexander replied, "The more impossible it looks, the more necessary it is to do it." He ordered his army to build a gigantic earthen ramp around the city. Since the sand was loose, it was an engineering nightmare, but they eventually raised the ground level to match the height of the city walls. The omen and the wound. During the siege, a strange event occurred. A bird flying overhead dropped a stone on Alexander's shoulder. His soothsayer predicted, "You will take the city, but you will be wounded today." The catapult shot. The prophecy came true. During a Persian sortie, counterattack, Alexander rushed forward to save his men. A bolt from a catapult was fired from the city walls. The injury: it punched through Alexander's shield and pierced his shoulder, penetrating deep into the muscle. Alexander collapsed. He survived, but the pain was excruciating, and his anger towards Baitus grew with every throb of the wound. The tunnels in the sand. While the ramp was being built, Alexander used a secret weapon: sappers or miners. Since the ground around Gaza was sandy, digging was easy. The Macedonians dug tunnels under the city walls and collapsed the foundations. The breach. After 3 months of siege, the walls cracked and fell. The Macedonians stormed the city. The people of Gaza fought to the last man, literally. Not a single soldier surrendered. 10,000 men died fighting in the streets. The fate of Baitus, the new Achilles. When the dust settled, Baitus was found alive, covered in wounds, but still standing. He was brought before Alexander. Alexander demanded Baitus kneel. Baitus refused. He didn't speak. He just stared at Alexander with defiant eyes. The horror. Furious at Baitus's silence and maddened by the pain in his shoulder, Alexander snapped. He decided to reenact a scene from the Trojan War. The act. Just as Achilles had dragged the body of Hector around the walls of Troy, Alexander ordered ropes to be pierced through Baitus's ankles. He tied the living man to the back of his chariot and dragged him around the city walls at full speed until he was torn to pieces. The destruction of Gaza was total. The men were dead, the women were enslaved, and the governor was erased from existence. Alexander had secured the entire coastline. He was now wounded and limping, but he was the master of the gateway to Africa. The violence was over for now. Ahead of him lay Egypt, where the people would not fight him with swords, but welcome him as a god.
March into Egypt and liberation from Persian rule. In late 332 BCE, Alexander left the bloody ruins of Gaza and marched south into Egypt. He expected another fight. Instead, he found a celebration. The Egyptians did not see him as an invader. They saw him as a savior sent by the gods to free them from the hated Persian yoke. The surrender of Mazaces. The Persian satrap, governor of Egypt, was a man named Mazaces. He had watched Alexander destroy Tyre and Gaza. He knew that Darius was far away in Babylon and that he had no hope of winning. The handover. When Alexander arrived at the border fortress of Pelusium, Mazaces simply opened the gates. The treasure. He handed over the entire Egyptian treasury, 800 talents of gold, and the royal fleet. It was the easiest victory of Alexander's career. Why Egypt hated Persia. To understand why the Egyptians cheered for a foreign army, one must understand their history. The Persians had been terrible rulers in Egypt. Religious disrespect. The previous Persian king, Artaxerxes III, had reportedly killed the sacred Apis bull, a living god to Egyptians, and served it at a banquet. The Persians mocked Egyptian animal gods and taxed their temples heavily. To the Egyptians, the Persians were not just oppressors, they were blasphemers. The respectful conqueror. Alexander knew this history, and he used it. He didn't enter Egypt like a master, he entered like a pilgrim. He traveled to Heliopolis and Memphis, the ancient capitals, worshipping the Apis bull. In a masterstroke of public relations, Alexander publicly offered sacrifices to the Apis bull, the very god the Persians had insulted. The impact. The Egyptian priests were stunned and delighted. By respecting their customs, Alexander proved he was not a barbarian like the Persians. Crowned as pharaoh. In the great temple of Memphis, the high priests crowned Alexander with the double crown, Psent, of Upper and Lower Egypt. The new titles. He was no longer just king of Macedonia or hegemon of Greece. He was now given the titles of the pharaohs, beloved of Amun, son of Ra, lord of the two lands. The conquest of Egypt was a turning point. Alexander had secured the breadbasket of the ancient world. Egypt provided massive amounts of grain. More importantly, he had transformed his image. He was evolving from a military general into a divine monarch. But before he settled down to rule, he felt a strange calling to go deeper into the desert, to a remote oasis where an oracle was waiting to tell him the secret of his birth.
Alexander as Pharaoh. Alexandria and the Oracle of Siwa. Alexander was now the pharaoh, but he didn't just want to rule Egypt, he wanted to change it. In early 331 BCE, he laid the foundation for the most famous city in the ancient world, and then undertook a dangerous pilgrimage that would change his psychology forever. He entered the desert as a king, but he would leave it believing he was a god. Designing the future. The birth of Alexandria. Egypt had great cities like Memphis and Thebes, but they were inland. Alexander wanted a city that looked towards Greece. He chose a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis. The flower blueprint. When Alexander laid out the plan for the city, his engineers realized they had run out of chalk to mark the ground. The improvisation. Alexander ordered his men to use barley flour, grain from the soldiers' mess kits, to mark the streets and walls. The omen. Suddenly, thousands of seabirds flew down and ate the flour. The engineers were terrified, thinking it was a bad omen. But Alexander's soothsayer, Aristander, smiled and said, "Do not fear. It means this city will be so rich that it will feed the entire world." He was right. Alexandria would become the intellectual and economic capital of the world for centuries. The march into the Deadlands. After planning the city, Alexander felt a strange calling to visit the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis, located hundreds of miles deep in the Sahara Desert. The danger. His generals warned him against it. Decades earlier, the Persian king Cambyses had sent an army of 50,000 men to Siwa, and they had disappeared into a sandstorm, never to be seen again. The lost army. The divine guides. Alexander's journey was saved by strange miracles. The rain. When the army ran out of water, a sudden, rare rainstorm hit the desert, saving them from thirst. The crows. When the sandstorms hid the path, 2 crows, some sources say snakes, appeared and flew in front of the army, guiding Alexander to the oasis. To Alexander, this was proof that the gods were personally escorting him. The slip of the tongue, pai dios.
When Alexander finally arrived at the temple of Zeus Ammon in Siwa, the high priest came out to greet him. He intended to greet Alexander in Greek as, "O my son, Pi Dios." The mistake, since Greek was not his first language, he mispronounced the word. Instead of Pi Dios, he stumbled and said Pi Dios. The meaning, Pi Dios, means, "O Son of God." Alexander was delighted. He took this linguistic error as a divine confirmation. He didn't correct the priest, he accepted the title. The secret questions. Alexander was allowed to enter the inner sanctum alone. When he came out, he refused to tell anyone exactly what was said, except that he was pleased. However, later accounts suggest he asked 2 questions. "Have all of my father's murderers been punished?" The oracle said yes. "Am I the son of Philip or the son of Ammon?" The oracle told him to never call Philip his father again, for his true father was the god Ammon, Zeus. The journey to Siwa was the final piece of the puzzle. Alexander returned to Memphis changed. He began to demand that people treat him not just as a military commander, but as a divine being. The son of Philip was dead in the sands of Siwa. The son of Zeus was now marching back to Asia to finish Darius once and for all. The final showdown at Gaugamela was approaching. March toward the heart of Persia. In the spring of 331 BCE, Alexander left the paradise of Egypt. He had rested his army, filled his treasury, and confirmed his divinity. Now he had to do the hard work. He marched his army back across the scorching sands of Syria towards Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, to find Darius. But this time, the journey felt different. There was no resistance, which was terrifying in itself. The silent trap. Why Darius waited. Alexander marched for months without fighting a single battle. This was suspicious. Darius's strategy. After losing at Issus in the narrow mountains, Darius learned his lesson. He realized his massive army needed space, the invitation. He deliberately let Alexander cross the vast Euphrates River unopposed. Darius wanted Alexander to come to him. He was luring the Macedonians onto the flat, dusty plains of Gaugamela, a killing field he had personally chosen and cleared of rocks so his chariots could run smoothly. The struggle at the Tigris. While the Euphrates was easy to cross, the Tigris River was a nightmare. It was swift, deep, and dangerous. The human chain. The current was so strong that it threatened to wash the soldiers away. Alexander ordered his men to lock arms and form a massive human chain across the river. The discipline. They carried their heavy shields and sarissas, pikes, above their heads to keep them dry, wading through chest-high water. The miracle. Amazingly, despite the fierce current, not a single soldier was lost. If Darius had attacked them at this moment, Alexander would have been destroyed. But Darius waited, confident in his trap ahead. The terror of the bleeding moon. On the night of September 20th, 331 BCE, just days after crossing the river, the sky turned against them. A total lunar eclipse occurred. The moon turned a deep, blood-red color. The panic. The Macedonian soldiers, who were superstitious, panicked. They shouted that the gods were angry because they were marching too far from home. A mutiny began to brew in the camp. They refused to march further. The spin doctor. Alexander quickly summoned his Egyptian soothsayer, Aristander. Aristander stood before the terrified troops and gave a brilliant interpretation. The sun represents the Greeks, and the moon represents the Persians. The moon is bleeding because the Persian Empire is about to bleed. The soldiers cheered. Alexander had turned a terrifying omen into a morale booster. The army was now deep in enemy territory, cut off from their supply lines and staring at bad omens in the sky. They were exhausted, but hopeful. Scouts rode back to Alexander with news. They saw campfire lights stretching to the horizon. Darius was waiting just a few miles away with the largest army ever assembled in human history. The march was over. The final test had arrived. The Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's tactical masterpiece. On October 1, 331 BCE, the sun roams over the dusty plain of Gaugamela. This was the heavyweight championship of the ancient world. Darius had 100,000, some say up to 1,000,000 men. Alexander had 47,000, but numbers didn't matter, because Alexander had a plan that is still studied in military academies today. The night before, I will not steal my victory. The night before the battle, the Persian camp was lit up with thousands of torches, while the Macedonians slept in the dark. General Parmenion came to Alexander and whispered, "Sir, look at their numbers. We should attack at night to cause panic. If we fight in the daylight, we will lose." The reply. Alexander famously rejected this. He said, "I will not steal my victory." He wanted to defeat Darius in the open sunlight so that no one could ever claim it was luck or a trick. He slept so soundly that night, his generals had to wake him up for breakfast. Defeating the chariots, the mousetrap. The battle opened with Darius launching his terrified weapon, the scythed chariots. They charged at full speed to slice the Macedonian legs. The counter-tactic, Alexander had drilled his men for this exact moment. Instead of holding the line, the Macedonian phalanx opened up. The trap. They created lanes, gaps in their formation. The horses, refusing to run into a wall of spears, naturally ran through the open lanes. As they passed, the soldiers trapped them and killed the drivers from the sides. The terrifying weapon was neutralized in minutes. The grand strategy, creating the gap. Alexander then did something strange. He began riding his cavalry far to the right, almost off the battlefield. Darius, fearing Alexander would flank him, ordered his left wing to follow Alexander. This movement stretched the Persian line until it became too thin, the wedge. Suddenly, a gap opened in the Persian center because their troops had moved too far left. This was exactly what Alexander was waiting for. He shouted the order. He turned his companion cavalry into a sharp wedge formation and charged straight into that open gap, directly at Darius. The king runs again. For the second time in history, Alexander and Darius looked at each other across the spears. The Persian royal guard fought bravely, but the sight of Alexander screaming and charging through the dust broke Darius's nerve. Just like at Issus, Darius turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. The King of Kings was the first to run. The hardest choice, glory or duty. Alexander started to chase Darius. He wanted to kill him and end the war right there. But a desperate messenger arrived from the rear. The crisis. Parmenion, commanding the left wing, was surrounded and being slaughtered by the Persian heavy cavalry. He begged for help. The decision. Alexander had to choose, catch Darius, glory, or save his old general, duty. He cursed his luck, but pulled his horse around. He abandoned the chase to save his army. By the time he rescued Parmenion, Darius had escaped into the mountains. Gaugamela was over. The Persian army was not just beaten, it was annihilated. Alexander was now the undisputed master of Asia. He sat on Darius's throne in the camp that night, proclaimed King of Asia. The Persian Empire, which had lasted for 200 years, had effectively ended in a single afternoon of brilliant tactics. Now the road to Babylon and its unimaginable riches was wide open. The final defeat of Darius III. The Battle of Gaugamela was the military defeat of Persia, but the personal defeat of Darius happened months later on a lonely road in the east. Alexander launched one of the most grueling high-speed chases in history. He didn't want to kill Darius, he wanted to capture him alive to make him surrender the crown legally. But fate and treachery had other plans. The betrayal within. After fleeing Gaugamela, Darius tried to raise a third army in Ecbatana, but his generals had lost faith in him. They saw him run away twice, Issus and Gaugamela. The coup. His cousin and satrap of Bactria, Bessus, along with other nobles, staged a coup. They didn't just disobey Darius, they arrested him. The golden chains. In a cruel twist of irony, they bound the King of Kings in golden fetters, chains, and threw him into a covered wagon like a common criminal. Bessus declared himself the new leader. The hardest ride. Alexander heard that Darius had been taken prisoner by his own men. Realizing that Bessus intended to kill Darius to prevent Alexander from capturing him, Alexander pushed his army to the breaking point. The pace. They rode hundreds of miles in just a few days, hardly sleeping, drinking muddy water, horses dying of exhaustion. Alexander rode with a small elite group, leaving the main army behind. He was desperate to save the man he had spent years fighting. The assassination. As Alexander's dust cloud appeared on the horizon, Bessus panicked. He told Darius to get on a horse and ride with them. Number 1. The refusal. Darius, broken and tired of running, refused. He reportedly said he would rather trust Alexander's mercy than run with traitors. Number 2. The stab. Furious, Bessus and the other conspirators threw their javelins at Darius. They stabbed their own king multiple times, killed the oxen pulling his cart, and rode off, leaving Darius to bleed to death in the middle of nowhere. The last drink of water. Alexander arrived minutes too late, but a Macedonian soldier named Polystratus found the cart first. The final request. Darius was dying of thirst. Polystratus found some dirty water and gave it to the king. Number 2. The last message. Darius did not curse Alexander. Instead, he told the soldier, "Tell Alexander that I thank him for the kindness he showed to my mother, my wife, and my children. I pray to the gods that he becomes the king of the world." With these words, the last legitimate king of Persia died. Alexander's grief. When Alexander finally rode up, he saw the body. He did not cheer. He did not celebrate. The gesture. He took off his own royal cloak, Climus, and covered Darius's body with it. He wept, not out of love, but out of frustration that he couldn't capture him alive, and out of respect for the fall of a great dynasty. The funeral. Alexander ordered that Darius be sent back to Persepolis and buried in the royal tombs alongside his ancestors with full honors. The war of vengeance was officially over. Darius was dead, but a new war had instantly begun. By killing Darius, Bessus had claimed the throne. Now Alexander had a new mission. He was no longer the invader of Persia. He declared himself the avenger of Darius. He would hunt down Bessus to the ends of the earth to punish him for killing his king. The chase moved east. The collapse of the Persian Empire. With Darius dead, the head of the snake was cut off, but the massive body of the empire remained. Alexander now moved to seize the heartlands of Persia, the great capitals of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. This was no longer a war of survival. It was a harvest of unimaginable wealth. The flowers of Babylon. Alexander expected a siege at Babylon, the cultural capital. Instead, the Persian governor Mazaeus, who had fought Alexander at Gaugamela, opened the gates. The hero's welcome. The streets were not lined with soldiers, but with flowers and silver altars burning incense. Lions and leopards were kept in cages as entertainment for the Macedonians. The policy. Alexander ordered the rebuilding of the ancient Babylonian temples destroyed by previous Persian kings. By respecting their gods, Marduk, he ensured that the Babylonians accepted him as their legitimate king, not a foreign tyrant. The loot of Susa, breaking the bank. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, the administrative capital. Here, Alexander found the cash that fueled the empire. The 50,000 talents. He seized 50,000 talents of silver and gold bullion. The scale. To put this in perspective, this was more money than the Greek world had seen in its entire history. He had to hire 1,000 pairs of mules and 3,000 camels just to transport the treasure. The recovered art. In Susa, Alexander found the famous bronze statues of Harmodius and Aristogiton, which the Persian king Xerxes had stolen from Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander sent them back to Athens, symbolizing that the war of revenge was complete. The last stand, the Persian gates. While the cities surrendered, the Persian army made one last heroic stand at a narrow mountain pass called the Persian Gates. The Persian Leonidas, a general named Ariobarzanes, blocked the pass with 40,000 troops at a wall built across the canyon. The ambush. When Alexander marched in, the Persians rolled massive boulders down from the cliffs, crushing the Macedonians. For the first time in years, Alexander was forced to retreat. History repeats itself. Just like a Thermopylae, a local shepherd showed Alexander a secret mountain path. Alexander led a team at night, climbed the cliffs, and attacked Ariobarzanes from behind at dawn. The Persian army was annihilated, clearing the road to the ceremonial capital. The burning of Persepolis. Finally, Alexander entered Persepolis, the jewel of the empire. This was the city of palaces, built by Darius the Great and Xerxes. The drunken decision. Alexander allowed his soldiers to loot the city for days, but the final act of destruction happened during a drunken banquet. A Greek courtesan named Thais stood up and shouted that Alexander should burn the palace of Xerxes to punish the Persians for burning Athens in 480 BCE. The fire. Drunk and excited, Alexander grabbed a torch. Thais grabbed another. Together they led a procession and set the massive cedarwood palace on fire. The meaning. By morning, the most magnificent palace on earth was a pile of ash. This act symbolized the final, irreversible death of the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander later regretted it, but the message was clear. The old world was gone. A new era had begun. The Persian Empire had not just been defeated, it had been dismantled. Its king was dead, its treasury was empty, its armies were scattered, and its capital was a smoking ruin. Alexander sat on the ashes of Persepolis as the richest man who had ever lived. But wealth is dangerous. The hard, disciplined Macedonian soldiers were now drowning in gold, and the luxury of the East began to corrupt the army from within. The real enemy was no longer Persia, it was their own success. Entering Babylon and the submission of the East. In October 331 BCE, Alexander marched into Babylon. While the surrender was mentioned earlier, the experience of entering the city changed the Macedonian mindset forever. This wasn't just a military occupation, it was a collision between a rugged European army and the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. Through the blue gates, a visual shock. To the Greeks, who lived in relatively simple cities with white stone buildings, Babylon was alien. The Ishtar Gate. The army marched through the massive Ishtar Gate, covered in bright blue glazed bricks and decorated with golden dragons and bulls. The scale. The walls were so thick that 2 chariots could race on top of them. The Greeks saw the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders, and the Tower of Babel, Etemenanke. For the first time, the Macedonian soldiers realized they were not conquering barbarians, but a civilization far older and richer than their own. The science of the stars, Alexander and the Chaldeans. Alexander was a student of Aristotle, and he treated Babylon like a university. The Chaldean priests, who were master astronomers, they had recorded planetary movements for centuries. The gift to science. Alexander ordered these astronomical records to be translated and sent back to Aristotle in Greece. The impact. This data revolutionized Greek science, correcting their calendars and maps of the stars. It showed that Alexander was still an explorer at heart, hungry for knowledge. The experiment, the double command system. Here, Alexander made a controversial political move that confused his generals. He reappointed Maceus, the Persian who had fought him, as the satrap, governor of Babylon. The check and balance. However, he created a new system to prevent rebellion. Civil power. Maceus, Persian, controlled the courts and the taxes. Military power. Apollodorus, Macedonian, controlled the army and the fortress. Tax collection. Asclepiodorus, Macedonian, collected the money. The strategy. He let the Persians feel like they were ruling themselves, but kept the swords and the money in Macedonian hands. It was a brilliant, pragmatic compromise. The softening of the army, the 34 days. The army stayed in Babylon for 34 days to rest. This period is historically significant because it marked the beginning of the army's corruption. The trap of luxury. The Babylonians were famous for their luxurious lifestyle. The rough Macedonian soldiers, used to sleeping on hard ground, were now sleeping in silk beds. They were introduced to perfumes, oils, and exotic foods. Curtius Rufus, Roman historian, noted that the discipline of the army began to crack here. The soldiers realized that being a conqueror was more fun than being a warrior. Alexander had to drag them out of the city before they became too soft to fight. Babylon was secured not by force, but by integration. Alexander left the city as a beloved king, having honored their gods and employed their leaders. But as he marched out towards Susa, he carried a dangerous new problem. His men had tasted the good life, and they were starting to wonder why they needed to march any further into the unknown east. The hunger for war was being replaced by the hunger for gold.
The treasures of Susa and the wealth of the empire. Leaving the pleasures of Babylon behind, Alexander marched east to Susa, the winter capital of the Persian Empire. While Babylon was the spiritual heart, Susa was the vault. This was where the great kings kept their most personal possessions. Here, Alexander didn't just find gold, he found items that revealed the insane level of luxury the Persian kings enjoyed and how unprepared he was for it. The cloth worth more than gold. In the vaults of Susa, Alexander found something more valuable than the gold bullion mentioned earlier. He discovered 5,000 talents of Hermione purple cloth, the 190-year-old treasure. This purple dye was made from crushing thousands of sea snails, murex, and was incredibly rare. The miracle. The cloth had been stored there for 190 years, yet the color was still as fresh and vivid as the day it was made. The value. In the ancient world, this purple was reserved only for gods and kings. Alexander was shocked that the Persians hoarded such wealth simply to let it sit in the dark. He immediately sent huge quantities of it back to Greece as robes for his friends, signaling that they were now the new royalty. The incident at the throne. One of the most famous anecdotes of Alexander's life happened in the throne room of Susa. To symbolize his victory, Alexander climbed the steps and sat on the golden throne of Darius. The physical mismatch. Alexander was physically shorter than the Persian kings. When he sat back on the massive throne, his feet dangled in the air. They didn't touch the floor. It looked childish and indignified. One of his royal pages quickly grabbed a low golden table nearby and slid it under Alexander's feet. Alexander relaxed, resting his muddy boots on it. The eunuch's tears. Suddenly, a Persian eunuch standing nearby burst into tears and hid his face. The reason? When Alexander asked why, the eunuch explained, "That table was the specific dining table of the great King Darius. He ate his meals off it. To see you resting your dirty feet on it is too much to bear." Alexander started to move his feet, but his general Philotas stopped him, saying, "Do not move. It is a good omen. You have trampled the enemy's luxury under your feet." The royal water. In Susa, Alexander discovered the extreme exclusivity of the Persian monarchy. He found silver jars containing water from the Choaspes River. The tradition: the great king was legally allowed to drink water only from this specific river. Wherever the king traveled, mule trains carried this boiled silver jar water with him. The power move. Alexander confiscated the jars and began drinking the water himself. It was a subtle message to the Persian nobles: "I am the only king now." The cultural blunder, the wool incident. Alexander tried to be kind to Sisygambis, Darius's mother, who was traveling with him, but in Susa he made a terrible cultural mistake. The gift. Alexander received some woven wool garments from Macedonia. He showed them to Sisygambis and said, "These were made by my own sisters. If you like them, I will teach your granddaughters how to weave wool like Macedonian women." The insult. Sisygambis began to cry. Alexander didn't know that in Persian culture, working with wool was considered slave labor. Royal women never worked with their hands. He had accidentally treated the queen mother like a servant. The apology. Alexander had to rush to her and apologize, explaining, "Mother, in my country even the queen weaves. I meant no insult." It was a stark reminder that conquering a land is easy, but understanding its culture is hard. Susa was secured. Alexander now possessed the purple robes, the golden throne, and the royal water. But the hardest challenge lay ahead. To get to the next capital, Persepolis, he would have to cross the Zagros Mountains in the dead of winter, where the fiercest warriors of the empire were waiting for him to ambush him at the Persian gates. The luxury was over. The mountain war was about to begin.
The burning of Persepolis. Revenge, symbolism, or drunken rage. In January 330 BCE, Alexander occupied Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. For 4 months he stayed in the palace of the great kings. Then, in one night of madness, he burned it all to the ground. Historians have debated for centuries. Was this a calculated political move, or the biggest drunken mistake in history? The trigger, the parade of the mutilated. Before the fire, there was a horror story that fueled the rage of the Macedonian army. As Alexander approached Persepolis, he was met by a group of about 800 elderly Greeks. The shocking sight. These were men who had been captured by Persian kings decades earlier. They were groaning and holding out olive branches. The mutilation. Every single one of them had been brutally mutilated. Some had their eyes gouged out. Others had their noses, ears, hands, or feet cut off. The Persians had branded them with letters on their foreheads. The reaction. Alexander famously wept when he saw them. The sight of these tortured countrymen turned the army's mood from triumphant to murderous. They didn't just want to conquer Persepolis anymore, they wanted to punish it. The Palace of Cedars. Persepolis was not just a home, it was a museum of the Persian Empire. The structure. The Palace of Xerxes was built with massive cedar beams brought from Lebanon. It was filled with tapestries, gold, and artistic masterpieces. The symbolism. This was the seat of the power that had burned Athens in 480 BCE. Every pillar reminded the Greeks of their past humiliation. The Courtesan's Challenge. According to the accounts of Cleitarchus and Diodorus, the destruction began at a drinking party, symposium. The setting. Alexander and his inner circle were drinking heavily. The atmosphere was wild. Among them was Thias, an Athenian courtesan, Hetaira, and the mistress of General Ptolemy. The speech. Thias stood up and made a speech that changed history. She reportedly said, "It would be the finest accomplishment of the campaign if I could set fire to the palace of Xerxes, who burned my city of Athens. Let a woman's hands destroy what the men of Persia built." The procession. The drunk soldiers cheered. Alexander, caught up in the moment, grabbed a torch. A procession formed, with musicians playing flutes and soldiers singing. The Inferno. Alexander led the way, but he allowed Thias to throw the first torch after him. The fire. The dry cedar wood of the roof caught fire instantly. The flames roared through the hall of 100 columns. The army's reaction. When the soldiers outside saw the flames, they didn't bring water, they brought more torches. They believed this was the king's signal that the war was over and they were finally going home. They joined in the destruction, looting whatever they could carry before the roof collapsed. The morning after. Regret or policy? By the next morning, the jewel of Persia was a smoking ruin. Plutarch writes that as Alexander watched the palace burn, his anger faded and regret set in. He supposedly ordered his men to put out the fire, but it was too late. 2. The political theory. Some modern historians argue it wasn't just drunkenness. By burning the central seat of power, Alexander sent a message to the Persians. The Achaemenid dynasty is dead. Do not hope for its return. It forced the Persians to accept him as the new reality because their old symbol was gone. The burning of Persepolis remains a stain on Alexander's legacy. He had destroyed one of the wonders of the ancient world. But the smoke of Persepolis signaled the end of the first phase of his life. The war of vengeance against Persia was officially complete. Now a new, darker phase began, the hunt for the traitor Bessus and the descent into the unknown lands of the East, where his own men would eventually turn against him. Adopting Persian customs and the birth of cultural fusion. By 330 BCE, the War of Conquest was largely over, but the war for the empire's soul had just begun. Alexander realized a hard truth. He could not rule the vast Persian population as a foreign conqueror. To keep the peace, he had to become one of them. This decision, however, horrified his Macedonian veterans, who watched their king transform into the very barbarian they had fought to destroy. The new wardrobe, a hybrid king. The first sign of change was visual. Alexander began to dress differently. To the Greeks, Persian trousers, pants, were ridiculous and effeminate. To the Persians, the bare legs of the Greeks were shameful. The middle way. Alexander designed a compromise. He refused to wear the full Persian trousers, anaxirides, or the tall pointed hat, tiara, of the great king. Instead, he wore a mix of the Macedonian cloak and the Persian sash. The Persian diadem, a purple headband, mixed with the Macedonian hat, kausia. The reaction. The Persians were pleased to see their ruler respecting their style. The Macedonians, however, mocked him behind his back, whispering that he was playing dress-up like a woman. The epigony, replacing the old guard. Alexander looked at his exhausted, grumpy Macedonian veterans and realized he needed an insurance policy. The 30,000 boys. He issued a decree to round up 30,000 young Persian boys from the best families. The training. He hired Macedonian instructors to teach them the Greek language and how to fight in the Macedonian phalanx formation. The name, he called them the epigony, the successors. The threat. His old soldiers immediately understood the message. If you complain too much, I will replace you with these Persian kids. This created intense paranoia in the camp. The Great Conflict, proskynesis. The tension exploded over a ritual called proskynesis. In Persian culture, when you approached the king, you bowed low to the ground and blew a kiss as a sign of respect. To them, this was social protocol, not worship. To the Greeks, however, prostrating oneself on the floor was an act reserved only for gods. A man never bowed to another man. The dinner party experiment. Alexander tried to introduce this custom at a private dinner. He wanted his Greek generals to bow to him just like the Persians did. The refusal. When it was the turn of Callisthenes, the court historian and Aristotle's nephew, to bow, he refused. He stood tall and offered only a handshake. The result. Alexander was furious, but he realized he couldn't force it. He dropped the requirement for the Greeks, but the damage was done. His friends now saw him as a tyrant who wanted to be worshipped like a god. Cultural marriage. Alexander didn't just change his clothes, he encouraged his men to change their lives. He began to promote marriages between his soldiers and Persian women. The goal. He wanted to create a new master race, a fusion of Greek intelligence and Persian hardiness. He envisioned a world without borders, where Greek and barbarian were no longer separate words. Alexander was succeeding in winning the hearts of the conquered, but he was losing the hearts of the conquerors. The gap between the king and his army was widening. The boys from home felt like strangers in this new, perfumed court. This resentment was simmering, and soon it would boil over into a plot to assassinate the king, not by Persians, but by his own Macedonian brothers.
Growing tensions with Macedonian soldiers. The purge began. By late 330 BCE, the grumbling about clothes and bowing turned into something deadly. The camp was no longer a brotherhood, it was a nest of vipers. The soldiers felt their king had become a foreign despot. In this atmosphere of paranoia, a conspiracy was discovered that forced Alexander to cross a line from which he could never return, killing his own best friends to stay in power. The plot that was ignored. It started with a minor soldier named Dimnus, who bragged to his lover that he was part of a plot to assassinate Alexander within 3 days. The terrified lover reported this to Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry and the son of Alexander's oldest general, Parmenion. The fatal mistake. Philotas listened to the report, but did nothing. For 2 days he met Alexander privately, but never mentioned the plot. When a third person finally told Alexander, the king was furious. He immediately arrested the conspirators. When asked why he didn't report it, Philotas claimed he thought the rumor was unimportant. Alexander did not believe him. The trial and torture of Philotas. Alexander suspected that Philotas was the ringleader. He ordered the arrest of his childhood friend. The show trial. Alexander brought Philotas before the army assembly. He accused Philotas not just of negligence, but of treason. He pointed out how Philotas had mocked Alexander's claim to be the son of Zeus. The army, already jealous of Philotas's arrogance, sentenced him to death.
But the death wasn't enough. Alexander wanted names. He allowed his other generals, who hated Philotas, to torture him. Philotas was whipped and burned until he confessed to plotting against the king. Then he was stoned to death by the army. The assassination of Parmenion. With Philotas dead, Alexander faced a terrifying problem. Parmenion, Philotas's father, was the most powerful general in the army. He was currently back in Ecbatana, guarding the massive treasury with 20,000 troops under his command. Alexander knew that once Parmenion heard his son had been tortured and killed, he would rebel. The ruthless logic. Alexander decided he could not take the risk. He acted on the ancient proverb, "Foolish is the man who kills the infant but leaves the father alive." He had to kill his most loyal general, a man who had served his father Philip and saved Alexander's life multiple times, purely out of fear. The assassination of Parmenion. Alexander sent a messenger on racing camels to ride across the desert to Ecbatana. The goal was to arrive before the news of Philotas's death. The messenger delivered a secret letter to Parmenion's own officers. While the old general was reading a letter, supposedly from his son, his officers stabbed him to death in the garden. He died, never knowing why. The aftermath. Fear rules the camp. When the soldiers found out that Parmenion, the father of the army, had been assassinated without a trial, a chill went through the camp. The new reality. They realized Alexander was no longer the boy king who led charges. He was now a suspicious monarch who would kill anyone, even heroes, to protect his throne. Censorship. Alexander opened the soldiers' letters home to Macedonia. Any soldier found writing bad things about the king was transferred to a disciplinary unit to be watched. The trust was gone. The execution of Parmenion and Philotas secured Alexander's safety, but it broke the heart of the army. The band of brothers was dead. Alexander was now surrounded by yes-men who were too afraid to speak the truth. He was safe, but he was alone, and in this isolation, his behavior would only become more erratic as he pushed deeper into Central Asia.
The murder of Clitus the Black. By the autumn of 328 BCE, the army was camped in Marakanda, modern Samarkand. The tension that began with the death of Parmenion had been simmering under the surface. It finally exploded, not on a battlefield, but at a drunken dinner party. This event is pivotal because it marks the moment Alexander realized he had lost control of his own temper. This section details the most personal and regretful murder of Alexander's life, killing the man who had once saved him. The Banquet of Flattery. It was a festival day for Dionysus, the god of wine. Alexander and his inner circle were drinking heavily. As the night went on, Alexander's sycophants, flatterers, began to sing songs mocking the old Macedonian generals and praising Alexander as a god superior to his father, King Philip II. The provocation. They claimed that Philip had done nothing remarkable and that Alexander alone was responsible for Macedonia's glory. The younger men laughed, but the older veterans sat in angry silence. Clitus snapped. Clitus the Black, the commander of the royal squadron, could not take it anymore. He was drunk, angry, and hurt by the disrespect shown to Philip. He stood up and shouted, "Stop mocking Philip! He was a greater man than all of you. All of Alexander's glory was built on Philip's foundation." The confrontation. Alexander tried to silence him, but Clitus continued. He turned to Alexander and delivered the ultimate insult. "You claim to be the son of Ammon, but you forget who saved you at the Granicus River. It was this hand, this right hand of mine, saved you from the Persian blade, and now you disown your father and call yourself a god?"
This mention of the Granicus, where Clitus had cut off the arm of the Persian noble Spithridates to save Alexander, humiliated Alexander in front of his court. The apple. Alexander, blind with rage, grabbed an apple from the table and threw it at Clitus's head. He looked for his sword, but a bodyguard had wisely hidden it. 2. The alarm. Alexander shouted in the Macedonian dialect, a sign of extreme distress, for his guards to sound the alarm, claiming there was a mutiny. His friends tried to hold him back, and others tried to drag Clitus out of the room. The return. Clitus was dragged out, but he broke free and returned through another curtain, quoting a line from a tragedy, "Alas, what evil customs reign in Greece." The spear thrust. Alexander snatched a long pike, sarissa, from a guard. As Clitus pulled back the curtain, Alexander ran him through the chest. Clitus fell dead instantly, the blood of the man who saved the king now staining the king's own floor. The instant regret. The moment Clitus hit the floor, Alexander's rage vanished, replaced by horror. The suicide attempt. He pulled the spear out of Clitus's body and tried to turn the point toward his own throat to kill himself. His bodyguards had to wrestle the weapon away. The grief. Alexander locked himself in his tent for 3 days without food or water, screaming Clitus's name. He refused to wash or sleep, tortured by the guilt that he had murdered his second father. The murder of Clitus was the psychological turning point of the campaign. The army forgave him, passing a decree that Clitus was guilty of treason to make Alexander feel better, but Alexander never forgave himself. He realized that while he could conquer the world, he could not conquer his own darkness. The king was becoming increasingly unstable, and the journey into India was yet to come. The Sogdian Rock and marriage to Roxana. After the tragedy of killing Clitus, Part 50, Alexander needed a victory to unite his army and heal his own mind. In 327 BCE, he faced a challenge that was not about brute force, but about psychology and mountaineering. He also met the person who would finally make him settle down. The challenge, do your men have wings? The local rebels, led by a warlord named Oxyartes, had retreated to a fortress known as the Sogdian Rock. The geography, it was a sheer cliff rising thousands of feet into the air, stocked with enough food for 2 years. It looked impossible to climb. The taunt. When Alexander asked them to surrender, the rebels laughed down from the cliffs. They famously shouted, "If you want us to surrender, you will need soldiers with wings. No one else can reach us here." The flying soldiers, the night climb. Alexander took this sarcasm as a personal challenge. He didn't order an assault, he asked for volunteers. The offer. He offered a massive reward of 12 talents, a fortune, to the first man who reached the top. The climbers. 300 experienced mountaineers who had grown up in the mountainous regions of Macedonia volunteered. The ascent. Under the cover of darkness and snow, they used iron tent pegs and flax ropes to scale the vertical cliff. It was incredibly dangerous. 30 of them fell to their deaths in the frozen ravines. But by dawn, their survivors were waving flags from the peak above the rebels. The psychological victory. The next morning, Alexander sent a herald to the rebels. The message? He pointed up to his men on the peak and said, "Look, I have found my soldiers with wings." The surrender. The rebels were so terrified by the sight of Macedonians above them that they surrendered instantly. They didn't know there were only a few hundred men. They thought Alexander's whole army had flown up there. It was a victory won without swinging a sword. Meeting the Star of Asia, Roxana. Among the captives was Oxyartes' daughter, Roxana. The appearance, historians recorded that when Alexander saw her, he was stunned. She was described as the most beautiful woman in Asia, second only to the wife of Darius. Love or politics? Usually, Alexander treated female captives as political hostages, but with Roxana, he did something different. The act. He fell in love. According to Plutarch, he refused to treat her as a captive. Instead, he sliced a loaf of bread in two with his sword and shared it with her, a traditional Macedonian wedding custom. The marriage of East and West. Alexander married Roxana in a grand ceremony. The strategic brilliance, while it might have been love, it was also genius politics. By marrying the daughter of the local warlord, Alexander turned his enemies into his in-laws. The brutal guerrilla war in Sogdiana, modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, ended almost overnight. The capture of the Sogdian rock proved that no mountain was too high for Alexander, and the marriage to Roxana showed he was building a permanent empire, not just passing through. With the north secured and a new queen by his side, Alexander turned his eyes towards the edge of the known map. The mysterious land of elephants and monsoon rains called to him. The invasion of India was next.
Fear, loyalty, and the price of absolute power. By 327 BCE, Alexander had crushed armies, married a princess, and declared himself a god. But absolute power comes with a terrible price: total isolation. He had killed his generals and his best friend. Now the danger came from the most unexpected place: the teenagers who guarded his bedroom. The royal pages, the next generation. Alexander was guarded by the royal pages, teenage sons of Macedonian nobles. They served the king personally, guarding his tent and helping him onto his horse in exchange for future promotion. They were supposed to be the most loyal. The boar hunt incident. The trouble started during a hunting trip. A wild boar charged at Alexander. The crime: a young page named Hermalius threw his spear and killed the boar before Alexander could strike. The punishment: Alexander, furious that a boy had stolen his glory, ordered Hermalius to be whipped in front of everyone and took away his horse. The shame: in Macedonian culture, this was a devastating public humiliation for a noble youth. Hermalius decided that Alexander was no longer a king, but a tyrant who needed to die. The Night Watch plot. Hermalius gathered other angry pages. They realized they had the perfect opportunity. The plan: the pages guarded Alexander's bedchamber at night. They agreed that on their next night shift, they would stab Alexander to death in his sleep. The accident: on the planned night, Alexander stayed out drinking until dawn. Some say a Syrian soothsayer warned him not to go inside. Because he never returned to bed, the boys couldn't kill him. The betrayal. The next day, one of the pages lost his nerve and confessed the plot to Alexander. The stone and the silence. Alexander arrested the boys. Under torture, they confessed but claimed they were doing it for liberty, calling Alexander a despot like the Persian kings. The execution. The boys were stoned to death by the army. Alexander showed no mercy to the children of his nobles. The death of the intellectual, Callisthenes. Alexander used this conspiracy to settle an old score. He blamed Callisthenes, his court historian and Aristotle's nephew. The link: Callisthenes had been the teacher of these boys. Although there was no proof he knew about the plot, he had previously refused to bow to Alexander, the proskynesis incident in Part 48. The end of free speech. Alexander accused Callisthenes of poisoning the minds of the youth. The fate: Callisthenes was thrown into prison. Some sources say he was carried around in an iron cage until he died of disease or was thrown to a lion. With his death, the link to Aristotle and Greek philosophy was broken. No one dared to criticize Alexander again.
The execution of the pages and the philosopher marked the final transformation of Alexander. He was now surrounded only by silence and fear. The loyalty of his men was no longer based on love, but on the terror of being the next victim. With his internal enemies purged, Alexander turned his gaze to the one place on the map that remained a mystery: India. The march into the unknown was about to begin. Alexander's psychological transformation, hero to tyrant. By 327 BCE, on the eve of the invasion of India, the Alexander who had crossed the Hellespont was dead. The charismatic boy king who slept with the Iliad under his pillow had been replaced by a brooding, paranoid autocrat. Before we witness the bloodshed in India, we must understand the dark change that had taken over his mind. The escape into alcohol. In the early years, Alexander drank to celebrate victories. Now, he drank to survive his thoughts. The change, historians note that his drinking sessions lasted all night, sometimes for 24 hours straight. The reason? The guilt of killing Clitus and the stress of constant assassination plots weighed on him. Alcohol became his medication. He became unpredictable, generous one moment, murderous the next. The clear-headed strategist was now often battling hangovers while planning empires. The rejection of Philip, the God complex. The most significant psychological shift was his relationship with his father, King Philip II. The denial, Alexander stopped tolerating any praise of Philip. He genuinely began to believe the oracle of Siwa, that he was the literal son of Zeus Ammon. The danger, this wasn't just propaganda anymore, he believed it. Since he was a demigod, he felt he was not bound by human laws or morals. This belief allowed him to justify cruelties like massacring entire villages that the younger Alexander would have rejected. From comrade to master. Alexander's leadership style changed fundamentally. Old way, in the beginning he was primus inter pares, first among equals. He ate the same food and shared the same jokes as his soldiers. New way, now he isolated himself in a purple tent. He surrounded himself with Persian guards because he no longer trusted Macedonians. He demanded silence and obedience, not advice. The band of brothers had turned into a master and slaves dynamic. The motivation for India, ego over strategy. Why invade India? Strategically, it made no sense. The Persian Empire was already conquered. The myth, Alexander was no longer fighting for security or money. He was fighting ghosts. Legend said that the god Dionysus and the hero Hercules had visited India. The obsession? Alexander felt he had to go there simply to prove he was greater than them. His transformation into a tyrant was driven by an insatiable need to outdo the gods themselves. As Alexander turned his army toward the Hindu Kush mountains, he was a lonely, terrifying figure. He had conquered the world, but he had lost his soul in the process. His soldiers followed him, not out of love, but out of fear and habit. They were walking into India, a land of monsters and monsoons, led by a man who was slowly losing his grip on reality.
Crossing the Hindu Kush, the gateway to India. In the spring of 327 BCE, Alexander turned his back on the conquered Persian Empire and faced a terrifying natural barrier, the Hindu Kush Mountains, which the Greeks called the Caucasus Indicus. Crossing this range was not just a military maneuver, it was a journey into mythology. The Greeks believed that beyond these snow-capped peaks lay the end of the inhabited world. The geography of terror. The crossing was physically more difficult than any battle. The army had to march at an altitude of 11,000 feet through deep snow. The struggle.
They were not prepared for the extreme cold. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and snow blindness. The food crisis. They ran out of grain. To survive, the soldiers had to kill their transport animals and eat the meat raw because there was no wood to build fires. It was a march of starvation. Myth become reality. The Cave of Prometheus. As they marched through the mountains, the Greeks were looking for signs of their gods. They believed that the Titan Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, had been chained to a rock in these very mountains. The discovery. Near a massive cave system, the soldiers found markings and heard local legends that convinced them they had found Prometheus's prison. The morale boost. Alexander used this to inspire his men. He told them, "We are walking in the footsteps of gods. If Prometheus was here and Hercules was here, then we are on a divine path." Alexandria of the Caucasus. Before descending into India, Alexander did what he always did. He built a city to guard his rear. The foundation. He established Alexandria of the Caucasus, modern-day Bagram, near Kabul. The population. He populated it with 7,000 local people, 3,000 retired mercenaries, and soldiers who were too old or injured to fight. The strategic purpose. This city served as a massive supply depot and a watchtower over Central Asia, ensuring that no rebellion could stab him in the back while he was in India. The first sight of India. Finally, after weeks of suffering, the army descended from the freezing peaks into the lush green valleys of the Kopan River, Kabul River. The new world. The air was warmer, the animals were different, monkeys and parrots, and the people looked different. The realization. The soldiers looked out at the horizon and saw the smoke of burning villages. They realized that the peace of the Persian Empire was behind them. Ahead of them lay a patchwork of warlords, elephants, and fierce tribes who had never been conquered by anyone. Alexander had successfully crossed the Great Barrier. He was now standing at the doorstep of the Indian subcontinent. The known map had ended. From this point on, every step he took would be into territory that no Greek had ever seen before. The War of the Elephant was about to begin.
The Siege of Iornos, rivaling Hercules. In the spring of 326 BCE, Alexander was in the Swat Valley, modern-day Pakistan. He had crossed the mountains, but before he could meet the great Indian armies, he faced a challenge that was purely mythical. A local tribe fled to the top of a massive rock fortress called Iornos, Pir Sar. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a battle for Alexander's ego. The myth of the unconquerable rock. The locals told Alexander that the rock of Iornos was so high and difficult that even the demigod Hercules, Alexander's ancestor, had failed to capture it during his legendary travels. The motivation. The moment Alexander heard that Hercules had failed, he became obsessed. He told his generals, "I must take this place to prove that I have surpassed my ancestor." It was a matter of pride, not strategy. The geography of the impossible. Iornos was a nightmare for any army. Height. It stood over 6,000 feet high. Defenses. It had steep, sheer cliffs on all sides and a flat top with enough water and farmland to feed the rebels for years. The gap. The only way to approach it was separated by a deep, terrifying ravine, canyon. There was no bridge and no road. Engineering in the clouds. Since he couldn't fly, Alexander decided to build a floor across the sky. He ordered his soldiers to cut down thousands of trees from the forest below. The mound. They used the tree trunks and dirt to build a massive earthen mound to fill up the ravine. The danger. The soldiers worked under heavy arrow fire from the rebels on the cliffs above. Alexander personally stood at the edge of the construction site, risking his life to cheer them on. The progress.
Day by day, the gap between Alexander's army and the rebel fortress got smaller as the mound rose higher. The psychological collapse. When the rebels saw the Macedonian mound reach the height of their own walls, they panicked. They realized that Alexander's engineers could change the landscape itself. The negotiation. The rebels sent a messenger offering to surrender. However, they were secretly planning to escape during the night and scatter into the dark forests. The night attack. Alexander discovered their plan to escape. Instead of waiting for the surrender, he led a daring night climb. The assault. He and 700 elite guards climbed the steep cliff face in the dark. They reached the top just as the rebels were trying to flee. The massacre. Many rebels, terrified by the sudden appearance of Macedonians on the peak, threw themselves off the cliffs to their deaths rather than be captured. Alexander stood on the peak of Iornos and offered sacrifices to the gods. He had done what Hercules could not. He had conquered the indestructible rock. This victory sent a shockwave through the region. The path to the Indus River was now clear. But on the other side of the river, the powerful king Porus was waiting with an army of forest beasts, war elephants, that the Greeks had never faced in battle. The greatest fight of Alexander's life was approaching.
The Battle of the Hydaspes, the War of the Elephants. It was May 326 BCE. Alexander had crossed the mountains and the Indus River, but now he faced the Jhelum River, Hydaspes. On the other side stood King Porus, Porava, a giant man rumored to be nearly 7 feet tall, waiting with an army unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen. This was the final boss fight of Alexander's career. The tactical nightmare, horses versus elephants. Alexander faced a unique problem. Porus had 200 massive war elephants lined up on the riverbank. The biology factor. Horses are naturally terrified of elephants. They hate the smell and the trumpet sound. Alexander knew that if he tried to cross the river directly, his cavalry horses would panic and throw their riders into the water before they even reached the shore. The psychological game, the boy who cried wolf. Since he couldn't cross directly, Alexander used psychology. The noise. Every single night, he ordered his army to make huge amounts of noise, shouting, banging drums, and lighting torches, pretending they were about to attack. The reaction? Porus would wake up his men and elephants and rush to the bank. But Alexander never attacked. The result? After weeks of this, Porus stopped reacting. He thought Alexander was just bluffing. That is exactly when Alexander struck. The crossing in the storm. On a dark, stormy night with heavy rain and thunder masking their sounds, Alexander took a small elite force 17 miles upstream. The surprise? They crossed the raging river on rafts made of skin and hay. By the time Porus realized what happened, Alexander was already on his side of the river. The trap was sprung. The clash of monsters. The battle that followed was the bloodiest of the entire campaign. The elephant charge. Porus's elephants charged into the Macedonian phalanx. It was horrifying. The beasts trampled men, impaled them with tusks, and grabbed soldiers with their trunks to throw them in the air. The axemen. The Macedonians, disciplined as always, used axes to chop at the elephants' trunks and legs. The panic. Maddened by pain, the elephants went out of control. They turned around and trampled their own Indian troops. The battlefield became a slush of mud, blood, and crushed bodies. The end of a legend, Bucephalus. Amidst the chaos, tragedy struck Alexander personally. His beloved horse, Bucephalus, who had carried him from Greece to India for nearly 20 years, was mortally wounded. The loss. The horse died soon after the battle. Alexander was heartbroken. He didn't just bury the horse, he built a city on that spot and named it Bucephala,
in honor of his faithful companion. Alexander won, but the cost was terrible. His men were shaken by the brutality of fighting elephants. King Porus was captured, wounded but unbowed. When Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his bravery, gave him back his kingdom, but the victory felt heavy. The Macedonians looked east, where rumors said thousands more elephants were waiting, and for the first time they felt fear. Marriage, politics, and control of the East. Following the grueling campaigns in the East, Alexander realized that swords could conquer land, but they could not conquer hearts. To create an empire that would last forever, he needed to blend the ruling classes of Europe and Asia into a single race. Upon returning to the Persian capital of Susa in 324 BCE, he orchestrated the largest and most controversial wedding ceremony in history. The Grand Design, the Susa Weddings. Alexander declared a 5-day festival to celebrate the union of East and West. He didn't just want allies, he wanted relatives. The scale. He set up a massive tent capable of holding 9,000 guests. Inside, he seated 80 of his top generals and ordered them to marry noble Persian women. The mass marriage. Outside the tent, 10,000 of his Macedonian soldiers were registered as having married Asian women. Alexander gave each of them a dowry from his own treasury. Alexander's new brides. Alexander was already married to Roxana for love and Bactrian politics, but polygamy was common for kings. At Susa, he made purely political matches to secure his claim to the throne. Statera, too. He married the eldest daughter of Darius III. The symbolism. By marrying the daughter of the man he defeated, he became the legal son-in-law and legitimate successor to the Persian throne, not just a usurper. Parasatis, too. He also married the daughter of the previous king, Artaxerxes III, uniting all branches of the Persian royal family under his name. The Brotherhood of Blood. Alexander made a fascinating choice for his best friend, Hephaestion. The match. He married Hephaestion to Drepetis, the sister of his own new wife, Statera. The logic. Alexander famously said he wanted Hephaestion's children to be cousins to his own children. Even in family lineage, he wanted his best friend to be tied to him forever. Buying loyalty, the burning of the deaths. Alexander knew his soldiers were unhappy with these forced marriages and his adoption of Persian customs. To buy their love back, he made a shocking announcement. The offer. He announced he would pay the personal deaths of every single soldier in his army. The suspicion. At first, the soldiers hid their deaths, thinking it was a trap to identify the gamblers and spenders. The action. Alexander poured heaps of gold onto tables and ordered his clerks to pay out cash without recording the soldiers' names. In one day, he spent 20,000 talents, a massive portion of the empire's wealth, to clear the financial burdens of his army. The Susa weddings were the climax of Alexander's vision of homonoia, unity of minds. He tried to force the Greeks and Persians to become one people. While the soldiers took the money and the wives, deep down the resentment was growing. The Macedonians felt they were being replaced, and this politics of fusion would soon lead to the greatest mutiny Alexander had ever faced.
Relentless guerrilla warfare in Central Asia. Between 329 and 327 BCE, the narrative of Alexander's conquest changed drastically. He was no longer fighting great armies on open fields. He was fighting ghosts in the desert. The region of Bactria and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, became a graveyard for Macedonian ambitions. The new enemy, the Wolf of Sogdiana. After the death of Darius, a local warlord named Spitamenes rose up. He was unlike any general Alexander had faced. The tactic: Spitamenes refused to fight a traditional battle. When Alexander marched forward, Spitamenes retreated into the steppes, grasslands. When Alexander turned back, Spitamenes attacked his supply lines. The danger: he was a master of guerrilla warfare. He used swift horse archers to strike quickly and disappear before the heavy Macedonian phalanx could even lift their spears. The massacre at the Polytimetus River. This war contains the darkest secret of Alexander's campaign, a defeat he tried to erase from history. While Alexander was busy founding cities, he sent a detachment of about 2,500 soldiers, led by his subordinate commanders, to hunt Spitamenes. The ambush: Spitamenes lured them to the banks of the Polytimetus River. The trap: he surrounded the Macedonians with horse archers. The Macedonians formed a defensive square, but they couldn't reach the enemy. The slaughter: panic set in. The Macedonians tried to swim across the river to escape. Spitamenes' men rowed into the water and slaughtered them. The result: nearly 2,000 Macedonian soldiers were killed. It was the single greatest loss of life for Alexander's army in the entire 10-year campaign. Alexander's rage: the scorched earth policy. When Alexander heard the news, he was furious. He marched his main army to the site, but Spitamenes had already vanished into the desert. Alexander realized he couldn't win by being a liberator. He had to become a destroyer. Changing the strategy, he stopped chasing the army and started targeting the population that supported the rebels: the flying columns. He divided his massive army into 5 smaller, mobile columns to sweep across the country simultaneously. The brutality: he ordered a scorched earth policy. Villages suspected of helping Spitamenes were burned to the ground. Thousands of men were executed, and water sources were destroyed to starve the rebels out. The end of Spitamenes. The war dragged on for 2 bloody years. It wasn't a military victory that ended it. It was exhaustion and betrayal. The betrayal: the local nomadic tribes, the Massageti, who had been allies of Spitamenes, grew tired of Alexander's relentless pursuit and the destruction of their lands. The grim gift: to save themselves, the tribesmen murdered Spitamenes. In December 328 BCE, they sent his severed head to Alexander as a peace offering. The war in Central Asia was won, but it changed the army forever. The soldiers were no longer fighting for glory. They were fighting a dirty, gritty war of survival against an invisible enemy. The shiny armor was gone, replaced by dust and blood. Alexander had learned that conquering a country is easy, but holding it against a people who want to be free is nearly impossible. With the rebellion finally crushed, he could now turn his eyes toward the final prize: India.
Alexander pushes east toward India. The Golden Alliance. In early 326 BCE, after leaving the brutal guerrilla wars of Central Asia and descending from the mountains, Alexander marched toward the Indus River. He expected every Indian king to fight him. Instead, he found something he hadn't seen since Egypt: a rich ally waiting with open arms. The enemy of my enemy, King Ambi. As Alexander approached the great city of Taxila, a center of learning and trade, the gates were thrown open. The ruler of Taxila, King Ambi, known to the Greeks as Taxiles, rode out to meet him, not with swords, but with gifts. The strategic surrender. Ambi surrendered his kingdom to Alexander instantly. The reason? Ambi was terrified of his neighbor, the giant King Porus, who ruled the lands further east. Ambi saw Alexander not as an invader, but as a powerful weapon he could use to destroy his rival Porus. The gift.
Ambi gave Alexander 200 talents of silver, 3,000 oxen, and, most importantly, 30 war elephants and 5,000 soldiers to help him fight Porus. The significance? This was the first time Alexander secured a base of operations inside India. Taxila became his headquarters to rest his tired army before the final showdown. The intellectual challenge. The gymnosophists. While in Taxila, Alexander heard about a group of holy men who lived in the forest, wore no clothes, and spent their days in deep meditation. The Greeks called them gymnosophists, naked philosophers. Alexander, always hungry for knowledge, sent his pilot Onesicrites to summon them. The refusal. The leader of the philosophers, Dandamus, refused to come. He sent a message back to Alexander. "I have no need of your gold, and I have no fear of your sword. If you kill me, you only kill my body. My soul will go to God. If you want to learn from me, come to the forest yourself." Meeting. Alexander was impressed by this fearlessness. He went to the forest and had a famous conversation with another philosopher named Calenus. The lesson of the hide. Calenus supposedly threw a dried ox hide on the ground and stepped on the edge. The other side popped up. Then he stepped on the center and the hide stayed flat. The meaning? He was teaching Alexander a lesson in empire management. If you stay in the center of your empire, Greece or Persia, you can control it. But if you wander too far to the edges, India, the rest will rise up in rebellion. The wealth of the Punjab. For the Macedonian soldiers, Taxila was a wonderland. The sights? They saw strange customs that shocked them. Widows burning themselves on their husbands' pyres, sati. People selling their children into slavery to pay debts, and massive bazaars filled with spices, gems, and peacocks. The morale? After years of fighting in the barren deserts of Sogdiana, the lush wealth of Taxila gave the soldiers false hope. They thought the hard part was over, and they would just march through India collecting gold. They had no idea that the war elephants of Porus were waiting just a few days' march away. The stop at Taxila was the calm before the storm. Alexander had secured his supply lines and made a powerful ally in King Ambi. He had also met the wise men of India, who warned him that conquering the world was a pointless vanity. Alexander listened, but he did not stop. The drumbeats of King Porus were calling him to the river Hydaspes.
Into the deep east, the siege of Sangala and the land of monsters. After defeating King Porus, Alexander's ambition grew even wilder. He believed the ocean at the end of the world was just a few days' march away. Ignoring the exhaustion of his men, he pushed deeper into the Punjab region, eastern Pakistan, northwest India. Here, the organized kingdoms disappeared, replaced by fierce, independent warrior tribes and terrifying jungles. The new enemy, the Cathayans. Unlike King Ambi or King Porus, the people of this region, known as the Cathayans, Cathaoi, had no king. They were a warrior republic who fought to the death. The reputation. They were famous for their beauty and their brutality. They reportedly selected their leaders based on appearance and strength. The challenge? They refused to surrender to Alexander. Instead, they gathered at their stronghold city of Sangala, near modern Amritsar, Lahore. The Battle of the Wagon Forts. The Cathayans used a tactic Alexander had never seen before, the wall of carts. Instead of building stone walls or lining up on a field, they circled their city with 3 rows of massive wooden ox carts or wagons. They stood inside this circle and fired arrows, using the carts as mobile shields. Alexander's solution? The Macedonian cavalry was useless against the carts. The dismount.
Alexander ordered his cavalry to get off their horses. He led the infantry on foot. The breaching. The soldiers physically pulled the heavy wagons apart by hand, crawling through the gaps while under fire. It was a chaotic, bloody mess, but the Macedonians eventually broke the circle and slaughtered 17,000 defenders. The horror of the jungle. New worlds. While the battles were hard, the environment was harder. The Greeks were entering a tropical world that terrified them. The monsoon rains. It rained non-stop for 70 days. Their clothes rotted off their bodies, their iron swords rusted, and their leather boots fell apart in the mud. The banyan trees. They saw banyan trees for the first time. The wonder. Historians recorded the soldiers' shock at seeing trees so large that 50 horsemen could hide under the shade of a single tree. They thought the nature here was magical or cursed. The giant snakes. The soldiers encountered massive pythons and venomous cobras. The Greeks claimed they saw snakes nearly 24 feet long. Fear of sleeping on the ground spread through the camp. The rumor of the Conqueridae. As they marched closer to the final river, the Hyphasis, the captured locals told Alexander a terrifying secret. The report? They said that beyond the desert lay a massive empire called the Conqueridae and Prasi, the Nanda Empire of Magadha. The numbers? This new enemy supposedly had 200,000 infantry, 80,000 cavalry, and 6,000 war elephants. The impact? Hearing this broke the spirit of the Macedonian soldiers. They had barely survived Porus's 200 elephants. The idea of fighting 6,000 was too much. Alexander had conquered Sangala and survived the jungles, but he had pushed his men too far. They were wet, sick, terrified of the giant snakes, and now they heard about an empire of elephants waiting for them. They stood on the banks of the Bees River, Hyphasis, looking east. Alexander wanted to go forward. His army wanted to go home. The stage was set for the most dramatic moment of the entire campaign, the Great Mutiny.
The mutiny at the Hyphasis. The army says no. By July 326 BCE, Alexander stood on the banks of the Hyphasis River, modern Beas River in India. This river marks the easternmost limit of his conquests. He had marched 11,000 miles from home. He wanted to cross the river to conquer the Ganges Empire, Nanda dynasty, but for the first time in 8 years, his army refused to follow him. The limit of human endurance. The soldiers were physically and mentally broken. The conditions. They had been marching in non-stop monsoon rain for 70 days. Their armor was rusted, their clothes were rags, and their hooves, horses, were worn down. The rumors. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the stories of the massive Nanda Empire with its 6,000 elephants waiting across the river terrified them. They realized that even if they won, there would just be another war after that. The horizon never ended. The speech of Alexander. Sensing the mood, Alexander called an assembly. He tried to shame and inspire them one last time. The vision. He told them, "The ocean is just a few days away. If we turn back now, we leave the task unfinished. Are you afraid of a few elephants? We conquered the world together. Do not leave your king now." The reaction. He expected cheers. Instead, he was met with total silence. The soldiers looked at the ground, weeping. The voice of the common soldier, Coens. Finally, a brave general named Coens took off his helmet and spoke for the men. This is one of the most famous speeches in history. The reality check. He said to Alexander, "Sir, look at our bodies. We are covered in scars. Our weapons are dull. Many of us are dead. Those who are alive want to see their parents and wives before they die. Moderation is a virtue even for a king. You cannot lead men who do not wish to follow." The soldiers cheered and cried so loud that Alexander stormed off in anger. The sulking of the king. Alexander was furious. He behaved like a petulant child. The isolation. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone. He hoped the army would change its mind out of guilt. The stalemate. The army waited in silence. They loved him, but they would not move east. Finally, Alexander realized he had lost. He came out and announced, "The omens are bad. We will turn back." The celebration. The soldiers shouted with joy, crying, "Alexander is invincible. Only he could defeat himself." The 12 altars. Before leaving, Alexander wanted to leave a mark that would last forever. The monument. He built 12 massive stone altars on the riverbank, dedicated to the Olympian gods. They were built like towers, higher than the greatest siege towers. The message. These altars marked the edge of the known world. They were a warning to anyone who came after. Alexander the Great came this far and no further. The march east was over. The conquest was finished, not by an enemy army, but by the will of his own men. But the journey home would not be a simple walk. Alexander, angry at being forced to turn back, decided not to return by the same road. He chose a new, dangerous route south, down the Indus River to the ocean, a decision that would nearly kill them all.
The Malian Campaign. Alexander's near-death experience. In late 326 BCE, the retreat began, but Alexander refused to march home quietly. Still angry at his men for the mutiny at the Hyphasis, he chose the most dangerous route possible, sailing south down the Indus River to the ocean. This route took them through the territory of the Mali, or Malavs, the fiercest warrior tribe in South Asia. Here, Alexander's recklessness almost cost him his life. The River of Blood. Alexander assembled a massive fleet of 1,000 ships to sail down the river, while his army marched along the banks. The strategy. It was supposed to be a parade of power. Instead, it became a slaughter. The Mali people refused to surrender. Alexander responded with extreme brutality, burning every city he passed to vent his frustration. The siege of the Malian citadel. The conflict reached its climax at the main Malian stronghold, likely modern Multan. The Macedonian soldiers, exhausted and wanting to go home, were climbing the siege ladders too slowly for Alexander's liking. The king's madness. Impatient and furious, Alexander grabbed a ladder and climbed the wall himself. The isolation. Seeing their king alone on the wall, the soldiers rushed to follow him. The weight was too much, and the ladders broke. The decision. Alexander was left stranded on top of the enemy wall, alone. Instead of jumping back down to safety outside, he jumped inside the citadel, directly into the middle of the enemy soldiers. The arrow in the lung. For a few moments, Alexander fought like a demon. With his back against a fig tree, he killed the Malian leader and several attackers, but he was outnumbered. The fatal shot. A Malian archer shot a massive arrow, reportedly 3 feet long, from close range. The injury. The arrow pierced Alexander's chest armor and went straight into his lung. Air and blood began to hiss from the wound. The collapse. Alexander collapsed on his shield. He was drowning in his own blood. At that moment, his bodyguards, Peucestus and Leonidas, managed to climb the wall and protected his body with the sacred shield of Troy. Finally, the Macedonian army broke down the gates. The rumor of death.
Seeing their king lying in a pool of blood, the soldiers went insane with grief and rage. The retribution. They slaughtered everyone in the city, men, women, and children. Not a single Malian in the citadel was left alive. The surgery. Alexander was carried back to the ship. The arrowhead was barbed and stuck in his rib cage. The operation, without anesthesia, doctors had to cut the arrow out. Alexander fainted from the pain. The recovery. Rumors spread to the main camp that Alexander was dead. To prove he was alive, he was propped up on a horse so his men could see him waving. The army wept, realizing how close they had come to losing their god-king. The Malian campaign was a military victory, but a personal disaster. Alexander survived, but he was never the same physically. The wound in his lung weakened him permanently. As the fleet reached the Indian Ocean, Alexander looked out at the water, preparing for the final, deadly march across the Gedrosian desert, a mistake that would kill more of his men than all his battles combined.
The March of Death, crossing the Gedrosian Desert. In 325 BCE, Alexander stood at the edge of the Indian Ocean. The conquest was over. Now he had to get his army back to Babylon. His admirals advised him to take the ships or the safe inland roads. Alexander refused. He chose to march through the Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Makran coast of Pakistan and Iran, a hellscape where no army had ever survived. The motivation, rivaling the legends. Why did Alexander choose a suicide route? The challenge. Legend said that two great rulers of the past, Queen Semiramis and King Cyrus the Great, had tried to cross this desert. Semiramis survived with only 20 men, Cyrus with only 7. The ego. Alexander wanted to prove he was superior to them. He wanted to conquer nature itself. The furnace of sand. As soon as they entered the desert, the horror began. The heat, it was so hot that they could only march at night. During the day, the sand was hot enough to burn the skin off their feet. The thirst, water sources were non-existent. Soldiers began to drink the blood of their transport animals or their own urine to survive. The discipline breakdown. The disciplined Macedonian army turned into a mob. Soldiers broke into the royal supply wagons to steal food. Alexander, realizing their desperation, refused to punish them. The flash flood. In a cruel twist of irony, many soldiers died from water. The event, one night while they were camped in a dry riverbed, wadi, a sudden rainstorm occurred miles away in the mountains. The wave, a massive flash flood, rushed down the dry canyon in the dark. It drowned thousands of women, children, families of soldiers, and horses who were sleeping in the low ground. Most of the baggage and loot from India was washed away into the sea. The helmet of water. Amidst the suffering, one of the most famous stories of Alexander's leadership occurred. Some scouts found a tiny trickle of water in a rock. They collected it in a helmet, barely enough for one person, and brought it to Alexander as a gift. The gesture. Alexander was dying of thirst like everyone else. He looked at the water, then looked at his soldiers who were watching him with dry, cracked lips. 2. The refusal. He said, "If I drink alone, my men will lose heart." He poured the water onto the hot sand, refusing to drink. Historians say this act was as good as a cup of water for every man in the army. It gave them the will to keep walking. The skeleton army arrives. After 60 days of horror, the army finally stumbled out of the desert into the province of Carmenia. The cost? When he entered the desert, Alexander had roughly 85,000 people, including soldiers and camp followers. When he came out, only 25,000 survived. The result,
He had lost 3/4 of his force without fighting a single battle. The king who had conquered the world had been humbled by the sun and the sand. The crossing of the Gedrosian Desert was a tactical failure, but a testament to Alexander's endurance. He arrived back in Persia not as a triumphant god, but as a survivor, leading an army of skeletons. But there was no rest waiting for him. While he was away in India, his governors had become corrupt, thinking he would never return. Alexander now had to clean up his own empire with a purge of executions.
Respect between conquerors. At the tomb of Cyrus. In early 324 BCE, having survived the horror of the Gedrosian Desert, Alexander arrived in Pasargadae, the ancient capital of Persia. He was physically wrecked, but his first priority was not rest. He wanted to pay homage to the only man in history he considered his equal, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. The shocking discovery. Alexander had read Xenophon's books about Cyrus since he was a child. He expected to find a magnificent monument. The scene. Instead, he found the tomb raided. The stone door was smashed open. The desecration. Thieves had tried to chop up the golden sarcophagus, coffin, to carry it away. They had thrown the bones of the great king onto the floor to steal his jewels. The Greek king's rage. Alexander was furious. He did not see Cyrus as an enemy barbarian, but as a fellow king of kings. The punishment. He tortured the guards who were supposed to protect the tomb. When he found out that a high-ranking Macedonian named Polymachus was responsible for the looting, Alexander had him executed immediately. The message. This sent a terrifying message to his army. Disrespecting a great king, even a Persian one, is a crime against royalty itself. The restoration. Alexander ordered his architect Aristobulus to repair the tomb instantly. The act. He paid for everything from his own pocket. He ordered the bones to be gathered, the coffin repaired, and the tomb to be sealed again. He laid his own royal cloak over the coffin as a gift to the dead emperor. The warning from the grave. The most famous moment occurred when Alexander read the inscription on the tomb. It shook him to his core. The inscription reportedly read, "O man, whosoever thou art and from whencesoever thou comest, I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Do not grudge me this little earth which covers my body." The reflection. Alexander stood silently for a long time. The realization. He realized that Cyrus had once conquered the known world just like him, and now Cyrus was just dust and bones, fighting for a few feet of earth. The foreshadowing. Historians believe this was the moment Alexander truly understood his own mortality. He realized that no matter how much he conquered, he too would end up in a small, dark room. This act of restoring Cyrus's tomb wasn't just about respect, it was a political statement. Alexander was telling the Persian people, I am not here to erase your history, I am here to continue it. But while he was honoring the dead, the living were plotting against him. His Macedonian generals were growing tired of his obsession with Persian culture, setting the stage for the final political crisis of his life.
The mutiny at Opis, the revolt of jealousy. In the summer of 324 BCE, at the city of Opis, near modern Baghdad, Alexander faced the most dangerous crisis of his reign. Unlike the mutiny in India, which was about exhaustion, this mutiny was about hate and replacement. The Macedonian soldiers realized that Alexander didn't just want to rule the Persians, he wanted to become one of them. The trigger, the arrival of the successors. Alexander introduced 30,000 young Persian soldiers into the army. The epigoni. He called them the epigoni, successors. They were trained in Macedonian fighting styles, wore Macedonian armor, and spoke Greek. the fear. The old Macedonian veterans looked at these young, strong Persian boys and realized the truth. Alexander doesn't need us anymore. They felt like discarded tools. The explosion. Alexander called an assembly and announced that he was sending the old and wounded veterans back home to Macedonia with huge bonuses. He expected them to be happy. Instead, the army exploded in rage. They didn't see it as a reward. They saw it as being fired. The insult. The soldiers shouted at him. Someone from the crowd yelled the most hurtful thing possible. "Dismiss us all! Go and campaign with your father Ammon!" This was a direct stab at Alexander's claim to be the son of Zeus Ammon, mocking him for disowning his real father, Philip II. The leap into the crowd. Alexander didn't sulk this time like he did in India. He snapped. The action? He leapt off the high platform directly into the angry mob of thousands of armed men. The arrest. With sheer terrifying presence, he grabbed the ringleaders by their tunics and dragged them out to his guards, ordering their immediate execution. The entire army was so shocked by his fearlessness that they fell silent. The famous speech. Alexander then climbed back up and delivered one of the most powerful speeches in history, recorded by Arrian, defending Philip. He reminded them that before his father Philip, they were just poor shepherds wearing animal skins on the mountains, afraid of their neighbors. Philip made them masters of Greece. Defending himself, he tore open his tunic to show his scars. "Show me a single part of your body that is not wounded. I have no scars on my back from running away. All my scars are on the front, fighting for you. And now you want to leave? Go home and tell them you left your king alone among foreigners." The reconciliation. After the speech, Alexander fired his entire Macedonian army. He replaced his guards with Persians and refused to see any Greeks. The breakdown. This broke the soldiers' hearts. They came to his tent crying, throwing down their weapons, and refusing to leave until he forgave them. The kiss. Alexander came out, weeping. When a soldier complained that Persians were allowed to kiss him, a Persian custom, but Greeks were not, Alexander replied, "But I make you all my kinsmen." He then held a massive banquet for 9,000 people to celebrate the reunion, ending the mutiny not with surrender, but with love. Alexander had won back his army, but the shadows were lengthening. He had survived battles, deserts, and mutinies. He was now the undisputed master of the world, loved by Persians and Greeks alike. But tragedy was waiting just around the corner. The one person Alexander loved more than his empire was about to be taken from him, leading to the final dark descent.
The death of Hephaestion. A part of Alexander dies. In the autumn of 324 BCE, the army moved to the cooler city of Ecbatana. The wars were over, the mutinies were settled, and the empire was at peace. But peace is often when tragedy strikes. Alexander had survived every weapon known to man, but he could not save the one person he loved more than life itself, Hephaestion. The fever and the wine. Hephaestion, Alexander's best friend and second in command, fell ill with a fever, likely typhoid, after days of drinking and celebration. The mistake. The royal physician, Glaucius, put Hephaestion on a strict diet, but while the doctor was away at the theater, Hephaestion, who was a heavy eater and drinker, reportedly ate a whole boiled chicken and drank a massive cooler of wine. The end. The shock to his system was too much. He collapsed. Alexander was summoned from the stadium, but by the time he ran to Hephaestion's bedside, his friend was already dead. The madness of grief. Alexander's reaction was not normal mourning. It was insanity. Hephaestion was his Patroclus from the Iliad, and without him, Alexander felt lost. The crucifixion of the doctor. In his rage, Alexander ordered the physician Glaucius to be crucified for failing to save Hephaestion. It was a brutal act of an irrational man. The mutilation of the world. To make the world share his pain, Alexander ordered strange decrees. The horses, he ordered the manes and tails of all war horses to be cut off, so even the animals looked like they were mourning. The music, he banned all music and flutes across the entire Persian Empire. The walls, he ordered the battlements of nearby cities to be pulled down, symbolically disfiguring the cities. The final campaign, killing for grief. Alexander needed to vent his anger. Since there were no wars left, he created one. The Kassians, a fierce mountain tribe called the Kassians, lived nearby. The manhunt. Alexander launched a winter campaign to hunt them down. He slaughtered every adult male he found. Historians called this massacre an offering to the ghost of Hephaestion. It was senseless violence born of pure depression. With Hephaestion dead, the tether that held Alexander to reality snapped. He began to drink more heavily than ever before, trying to numb the silence in his heart. He returned to Babylon, the center of his world, not knowing that he was marching towards his own bedbed. The stage was set for the final week of the king's life.
Omens of doom and the entry into Babylon. By the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander approached Babylon for the last time. He was 32 years old, the master of the known world, yet he was haunted by grief and paranoia. The city that had once welcomed him with flowers now seemed to warn him of his end. The warning of the Chaldeans. As Alexander marched toward the massive walls of Babylon, he was stopped by a group of Chaldean astrologers, the same priests he had befriended years ago. The prophecy. Their leader, Bellefontes, warned him, "Do not enter the city facing west. The god Bel has revealed that if you enter Babylon now, it will be fatal for you." The attempt. Alexander took this seriously. He tried to march his army around the city to enter from the east. However, the terrain was swampy and impassable. Frustrated and stubborn, he ignored the warning and entered through the forbidden gate. The mystery of the stranger on the throne. Once inside the palace, a terrifying incident occurred that shook the entire court. Alexander had left the throne room briefly to get a massage or play ball. When he returned, he saw a stranger sitting on his royal throne. The scene. The man was wearing the king's royal diadem and robes, sitting silently. The interrogation. When the guards tortured him to ask who he was, the man, possibly a prisoner named Dionysus, said he didn't know how he got there. He claimed the god Serapis had unshackled him and told him to sit there. The meaning. The seers interpreted this as a sign that the throne would soon be empty. Alexander ordered the man executed, but the fear remained. The missing liver. Alexander began sacrificing animals daily to appease the gods, but the results were terrifying. The omen. When the priests cut open the sacrificial animals, they found that the liver had no lobe. A vital part was missing. The interpretation. In ancient Greek and Babylonian culture, a lobeless liver was the ultimate sign of doom for a ruler. It meant the head of the state was about to be cut off. The final banquet. Despite the omens, Alexander continued his heavy drinking to drown the sorrow of Hephaestion's death. On the night of May 29, 323 BCE, he attended a party hosted by his friend, Medius of Larissa. The Cup of Hercules. According to some accounts, Alexander decided to drink from a massive bowl of unmixed wine, known as the Cup of Hercules, holding about 6 quarts. 2. The Scream. He downed the wine in one go. Suddenly, he let out a loud cry, as if someone had stabbed him in the back with a spear. He didn't collapse from drunkenness. He collapsed from sudden, excruciating pain. He was carried to his bed, unable to stand. The soldiers thought it was just another hangover, but the fever that started that night would not break. The omens were right. The king had entered Babylon, but he would never leave it alive. The final countdown had begun.
The long agony, the final 10 days. It was June 323 BCE. The man who had survived the spears of the Persians, the scythes of the chariots, and the tusks of the elephants was now being destroyed by an invisible enemy, a mysterious fever. For 10 days, the palace of Babylon turned from a place of celebration into a silent tomb. The progression of the illness. Alexander did not die instantly. It was a torture that lasted nearly 2 weeks. Days 1 through 3. At first, Alexander tried to ignore the fever. He continued to issue orders for a new invasion of Arabia. He played dice with his friend Medius, believing he would recover. Days 4 to 6. The fever spiked. He lost the ability to move his legs. He was carried from his bedroom to the summer house near the river, hoping the cool breeze would help. It didn't. He stopped speaking to his generals about war and started speaking only to the priests. The loss of voice. By June 7th, the most charismatic voice in history fell silent. The symptom. Alexander became mute. He was conscious and his eyes were open, but he could no longer speak. The panic. When the generals asked him who should lead the army or what are your orders, he could only move his eyes. The command structure of the empire began to collapse instantly. Without his voice, there was no law. The soldiers' mutiny of grief. A rumor spread through the camp that Alexander was already dead and the generals were hiding the body. The riot. The Macedonian soldiers, the common infantry who had marched with him for 12 years, grabbed their weapons. They threatened to storm the palace and kill the generals if they didn't see their king. The compromise. The generals were forced to open the palace gates. They made a hole in the wall of Alexander's bedroom to let the soldiers pass through. The silent parade. This is one of the most tragic scenes in ancient history. The scene. Thousands of rough, battle-hardened soldiers walked past Alexander's bed in a single-file line. They were crying, some tearing their clothes in grief. The goodbye. Alexander was too weak to lift his head or speak, but historians record that as each soldier passed, he struggled to raise his hand slightly or moved his eyes to acknowledge them. It was a silent final goodbye between the king and his boys. The signet ring. On the final day, June 10th, 323 BCE, knowing the end was seconds away, Alexander performed his last official act. The transfer. He took the royal signet ring, the symbol of ultimate power, off his finger. The recipient. He handed it to Perdiccas, his senior bodyguard and cavalry commander. He didn't speak, but the gesture meant, "You are in charge for now." He did not name an heir, he only handed over the responsibility. The fever burned him out completely. As evening fell over Babylon, the breathing of the 32-year-old conqueror stopped. The man who claimed to be the son of Zeus was dead. But the chaos was just beginning, because before he lost his voice, he had reportedly whispered one final cryptic answer about who should succeed him, an answer that would set the world on fire for the next 40 years.
The last words, to the strongest. On the evening of June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great lay dead in Babylon. But before his heart stopped, he whispered a final sentence that would plunge the world into 40 years of chaos. The ultimate question. Just moments before he fell into his final coma or lost his voice completely, his generals gathered around his bed. They asked him the most important question in history. To whom do you leave your kingdom? They expected him to name a successor, perhaps his half-brother, Aridaeus, or his unborn child with Roxana, or even his general, Perdiccas. The answer that burned the world. Alexander struggled to speak. According to historians like Arrian and Diodorus, he whispered one Greek word, kratisto, to the strongest. The ambiguity. Interpretation A, he meant the strongest general should take over. This was essentially an invitation for his generals to fight each other to prove who was the strongest. Interpretation B, conspiracy. Some historians argue he might have said Cratero to Craterus. Craterus was his most loyal and respected general, but he was far away in Cilicia, leading the veterans home. If he said Craterus, the generals in the room, like Perdiccas, likely ignored it to seize power for themselves. The prophecy. Alexander supposedly added one final comment before dying. I foresee a great funeral contest over me. He knew his friends were not loyal brothers, but hungry wolves. He knew they would tear his empire apart to get a piece of the throne. The body on the table. The moment Alexander was declared dead, the discipline of the army evaporated. The darkness. Legend says the torches in Babylon were extinguished, and a terrified silence fell over the city. People locked their doors, fearing looting. The neglect. In the chaos of political arguments, Alexander's body was reportedly left alone and forgotten in the heat for several days. The miracle. When the embalmers finally arrived to prepare the body, they were shocked. Despite the heat, the body showed no signs of decay, decomposition. The Egyptians and Chaldeans claimed this was final proof that he was not a man, but a god. The first blood, the division. Within 24 hours, the funeral contest began. The infantry versus the cavalry. The foot soldiers wanted to make Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, the king. The cavalry, led by the generals, wanted to wait for Roxana's baby to be born. The result? Swords were drawn in the palace. The blood of Macedonians was spilled by Macedonians right next to Alexander's deathbed. The unity of the empire died with him. Alexander was gone. He left no clear heir, only a ring given to Perdiccas and a riddle to the strongest. The golden age was over. Now began the wars of the successors, Diadochi, a brutal era where Alexander's mother, wife, son, and generals would all murder each other in a desperate grab for his crown. The world lost its king, and the wolves were now in charge.
The partition of Babylon, the wolves' feast. Alexander was dead. His body lay cold in the palace of Babylon, but the room was getting hotter. The funeral contest he had predicted began immediately. Without a living heir, the Macedonian generals stopped being comrades and became rivals. The crisis of the empty throne. The generals, the Diadochi, gathered in the throne room. The atmosphere was tense. The proposal. Perdiccas, who held Alexander's ring, suggested they wait. Roxana was pregnant. If she had a boy, he would be king. The opposition? The infantry soldiers hated this idea. They didn't want to wait for a half-Persian baby who wasn't even born yet. They wanted a pure Macedonian king now. The infantry revolt. King Aridius. A chaotic riot broke out, led by a general named Meliacer. The puppet king. The soldiers dragged Alexander's half-brother, Aridius, out of the shadows. The tragedy. Aridius was mentally disabled, possibly due to poison given to Olympias years ago. The soldiers put the royal robe on him and declared him King Philip III. The standoff. For a few days, it looked like the cavalry, Perdiccas, and the infantry, Meliacer, would butcher each other right inside Babylon. The deadly compromise. To prevent a civil war, a strange deal was struck. The joint kings. It was agreed that Philip III, Aridius, the disabled brother, and Alexander IV, Roxana's unborn baby, assuming it was a boy, would rule together as joint kings. The regent, Perdiccas, would rule in their name as the regent of the empire. Carving up the world. Once the kings were chosen, the generals demanded their rewards. They divided the massive empire into satrapies or provinces, ostensibly to govern them, but in reality to turn them into their own private kingdoms. Ptolemy, he cleverly asked for Egypt. It was rich, isolated, and easy to defend. He knew exactly what he was doing. Lysimachus, he took Thrace, part of Europe. Antigonus, he took huge parts of Asia Minor, Turkey. Seleucus, he was given command of the elite cavalry guard, a position of power that he would later use to seize the entire East. The First Purge. The peace didn't last long. Perdiccas, now the regent, wanted to secure his power. The betrayal. He invited Meliacer, the leader of the infantry revolt, to a religious ceremony to purify the army. The execution. At a signal, Perdiccas ordered his war elephants to trample Meliacer's supporters to death in front of the horrified army. Meliacer was executed shortly after. The partition of Babylon was a temporary patch on a shattering window. The empire was technically united under two puppet kings, but the real power lay with the wolves, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Perdiccas, who were already sharpening their knives. The next phase of history would not be about conquest. It would be about the wars of the successors, starting with the theft of the most valuable object in the world, Alexander's dead body.
The heist of the century. Ptolemy steals the body. The year was 321 BCE. Alexander had been dead for 2 years. His generals were no longer content with just ruling provinces. They wanted to be the new Alexander. According to Macedonian tradition, the king who buries the previous king is the rightful successor. This led to the most bizarre military operation in history, a war fought not over land, but over a coffin. The golden carriage. For 2 years, artisans worked day and night to build a funeral cart worthy of a god. The spectacle. It was a massive temple on wheels, pulled by 64 mules. It was covered in gold, jewels, and paintings of Alexander's wars. The destination. The regent, Perdiccas, ordered the body to be taken to Macedonia to be buried in the royal tombs at Aigai. This would cement Perdiccas's authority as the guardian of the royal family. The conspiracy. Ptolemy, the governor of Egypt, knew that if Perdiccas buried Alexander, Perdiccas would become the unquestioned emperor. Ptolemy wanted to break away and make Egypt his own independent kingdom. To do that, he needed the body. The plan. He secretly gathered an army and marched into Syria to intercept the funeral procession. The interception. As the funeral cart moved slowly through Syria, Ptolemy struck. The bribe or the sword? Historians differ on whether Ptolemy fought the guards or simply bribed them. Either way, he seized control of the golden carriage. The detour.
Instead of letting it go north to Macedonia, Ptolemy turned the mules south toward Egypt. He claimed that Alexander had wanted to be buried in Egypt, at the Oracle of Siwa, not in the cold mountains of Macedonia. The chase. When Perdiccas heard the news, he was furious. This was an open declaration of war. The reaction. Perdiccas abandoned his plans to conquer other lands and marched his entire grand army toward Egypt to kill Ptolemy and recover the body. The stakes. The Aryan funeral games had turned into a real war. The unity of the empire was officially broken. The tomb in Alexandria. Ptolemy successfully brought the body to Memphis and later to the city of Alexandria. The symbol. By possessing the body, Ptolemy legitimized his rule. He was no longer just a governor, he was the keeper of the god-king. The legacy. Alexander's tomb in Alexandria became a pilgrimage site for centuries, visited by Caesar and Augustus, while Perdiccas marched to his doom in the Nile Delta, trying to get it back. The theft of the body was the point of no return. It proved that the generals cared more about their own power than their dead king's wishes. Ptolemy had won the first round of the Wars of the Successors, but Perdiccas was coming with the royal army and the war elephants, determined to drown the thief in the Nile.
The murder of the royal family. The end of the bloodline. Alexander conquered the world to build a legacy for his children. But in a cruel twist of fate, his immense fame became a death sentence for his family. His generals, who once bowed to him, realized that as long as Alexander's son lived, they could never truly be kings. The rise of the villain, Cassander. While generals like Ptolemy and Seleucus were busy carving up Asia and Egypt, a general named Cassander, son of Antipater, took control of Macedonia, Greece. The hatred. Cassander hated Alexander personally. He was the man who once laughed at Alexander's claim to be a god, for which Alexander had bashed his head against a wall. Now, with Alexander dead, Cassander sought revenge against his family. The last stand of the mother, Olympias, Alexander's mother. Olympias was fierce and terrifying. She tried to protect her grandson, Alexander IV, by raising an army. The brutality. To secure the throne for her grandson, she executed Alexander's half-brother, King Philip Aridaeus, and his wife. She fought like a tigress, but she made too many enemies. The siege of Pydna. Cassander trapped Olympias in the city of Pydna. He starved the city until the people resorted to cannibalism. Olympias was forced to surrender in 316 BCE on the promise that her life would be spared. The execution of Olympias. Cassander broke his promise immediately. The trial. He organized a show trial where the relatives of the people Olympias had killed demanded justice. The death. Cassander ordered her execution. According to legends, she did not run or scream. She adjusted her robes and covered her face, dying with the dignity of a queen. With her death, the protector of Alexander's son was gone. The boy king in the dungeon. Now the only obstacles left for Cassander were Alexander's wife, Roxana, and his 13-year-old son, Alexander IV. The imprisonment. Cassander stripped them of their royal titles and locked them away in the heavy fortress of Amphipolis. They were kept in solitary confinement, cut off from the world. The panic. As the boy approached the age of 14, adulthood in Macedonia, the people began to whisper. Loyal soldiers started demanding that Alexander's son be released and made the true king. The extinction of the line. Cassander knew he had to act before the boy came of age. In 310 BCE, he sent a secret order to the prison guards. The murder. In the darkness of the dungeon, guards poisoned or strangled both Roxana and the young Alexander IV. The burial. To hide the crime, their bodies were buried in secret, without any royal honors or funeral rites.
With the death of the young boy, the direct bloodline of Alexander the Great and the line of Achilles and Hercules that he was so proud of was extinguished forever. The empire was no longer a family inheritance. It was now a carcass to be devoured by the strongest wolves. The path was finally clear for the generals to declare themselves kings. The story of one man's dream was over. The story of a divided world had begun.
The end of an era, the divided world, and the eternal legacy. The bloodline of Alexander was gone, wiped out by the cruelty of Cassander. The dream of a united world died with the young prince in the dungeon. But while the man was dead, the shadow he cast over the world was just beginning to grow. The feast of the wolves, the partition of the world. As Alexander predicted, his generals fought a bloody funeral contest. After decades of war, the map was permanently redrawn, creating the foundation of the geopolitical world we know today. Ptolemy, Egypt, he secured the richest prize. He established the Ptolemaic dynasty, turning Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the world. His line would rule for 300 years, ending with the famous Cleopatra. Seleucus in the east. He took the largest portion, from Turkey to the borders of India. His Seleucid Empire blended Greek and Persian cultures, creating a new cosmopolitan society. Cassander in Macedonia. The murderer of Alexander's family took the homeland, Greece and Macedonia. Lysimachus in Thrace. He ruled parts of Asia Minor and Europe. The Indian connection, a new world order. In the East, Alexander's departure created a vacuum that led to the rise of India's first great empire, Chandragupta Maurya. Inspired by Alexander's example, the young Indian leader unified the subcontinent. The deal. When Seleucus tried to reconquer India in 305 BCE, he was stopped by Chandragupta. They signed a historic peace treaty. Seleucus gave up territory in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and in return, Chandragupta gave him 500 war elephants. The fusion. This led to centuries of trade and the birth of Gandhara art, where statues of the Buddha were carved wearing Greek-style robes, a visible symbol of Alexander's cultural impact. The cultural victory. The Hellenistic Age. Alexander's greatest conquest was not land, but culture. He started the Hellenistic Age. The Library of Alexandria. The city he founded in Egypt became the brain of humanity. It gathered the knowledge of the East and West. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine flourished. The common tongue. Greek became the koine, common language of the world. For the first time in history, a scholar in India, a merchant in Egypt, and a politician in Rome could understand each other. The mystery of the God-King, the lost tomb. One final mystery remains. What happened to Alexander himself? The pilgrimage. For centuries, his golden coffin in Alexandria was the most sacred site in the Mediterranean. Roman emperors like Julius Caesar and Augustus visited it to pay respects. Caesar famously wept at the foot of the statue, realizing he had achieved nothing compared to Alexander. The disappearance. Sometime after the 4th century AD, amidst riots and religious changes, the tomb vanished. The question, is he still there, sleeping beneath the modern streets of Alexandria, or was he destroyed? To this day, archaeologists are hunting for the final resting place of the king. The verdict, hero or villain. As we close the book on his life, the question remains, who was he? The villain.
He was a mass murderer who killed hundreds of thousands. He burned cities, killed his friends in drunken rages, and possessed an ego that consumed everything around him. He was a force of destruction. The hero. He was a visionary who shattered the boundaries of the possible. He proved that a small army could conquer the world through discipline and will. He tried to merge races and cultures when the rest of the world wanted to keep them separate. Perhaps he was simply the ultimate tragic hero, a man who conquered the entire world but could never conquer his own demons. On a hot afternoon in Babylon in 323 BCE, the heart of the 32-year-old conqueror stopped beating. He left no heir, only a ring and a riddle. But in his short life, he burned so brightly that he blinded the world for centuries. From the sands of Egypt to the snows of the Himalayas, he changed everything he touched. Kings have come and gone, empires have risen and fallen, but history remembers only one man simply as the Great. The end.